4. Order. Good morning, everyone. This is the session in the Business and Trade Select Committee's inquiry into the UK's industrial policy, and in particular today we're looking at opportunities for growth within manufacturing and other emerging technologies. And we start off with a panel of experts in the field of manufacturing. And if I can get things started by asking each of you to tell us a little bit about the organisation that you represent, but telling us a little bit about how the competitive landscape for manufacturers, and specifically those involved in advanced manufacturing, how that's changed in recent years and what the opportunities are for the UK. So perhaps Dr. Torbett to start.
Very happy to, and good morning. My name is Richard Torbett. I am the Chief Executive of the Association of the British Pharmaceutical Industry. We represent the industry researching, developing and manufacturing medicines in the UK. The pharmaceutical industry the UK, I should say, has been one of the homes of the industry globally. To give you some brief statistics by way of background, we generate about £17.5 billion worth of direct GVA for the UK, with an additional 45 billion of wider spillovers that generally come from research and development. I say research and development because the interplay between R&D activities and manufacturing is very important, and the two sort of really go hand in hand. We're the largest investor in R&D by quite some way, with about £9 billion each year. We export around £25 billion and 126,000 jobs. So I'll stop there with the numbers, but if the committee would like any more statistics, that's fine. I think recent years, from a competitive position, have been, I would say, mixed. I will start with the negative, if I can put it that way. We did slip down significantly the trade balance rankings globally between about 2010 and 2020. So 2010 we were 4th in the world. By 2020 we were 98th in the world. So it was quite a fall. There have been some green shoots since then, and we're looking to see how that translates into the numbers. We lost global share in R&D over the same period, and also lost some of our clinical trials performance. During the pandemic, of course, manufacturing in the medicine sector was a source of strength in the UK. We played a very critical role globally with the production of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine. So a real sort of success story there. I would say recent years, I think, have been marked by a real improvement in the policy landscape supporting manufacturers, certainly in this sector. We've certainly warmly welcomed some of the recent announcements around capital grant funding for advanced medicines manufacturing, full expensing of capital, and an emphasis on skills in the recent advanced manufacturing strategy, which I think is very positive. And most recently we've seen some good news with AstraZeneca announcing a new investment in Speak in Cambridge, which I think is a good sign for the future. So we've had some troubles, but we've got some good policy in place, I think, now, and I think we really need as much stability and predictability as possible. I will pause there, Chair.
Okay, thank you. And Katherine, Bennett, you're Chief Executive of the High Value Manufacturing Catapult. We last met at the Manufacturing Technology Centre in my constituency,
Indeed,
so
yes.
Very familiar with some of the work that's going on there. How do you see things?
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation to be invited. So, the High Value Manufacturing Catapult. Interesting name. How do I describe it? So we're all about helping businesses learn more about improving their productivity and the general competitive situation that many manufacturers in the UK face. We help to de-risk innovation. So companies who are thinking about improving their production line can come and have a look at some of our amazing centres. We've got 27 sites around the UK with 3,500 employees, many of them anchored very importantly in key parts of the UK outside of London, in the North East, up in Scotland, up in the Midlands, down in Bristol, and we have quite a wide reach geography-wise. In terms of how manufacturing is faring, of course, manufacturing is very much impacted by geopolitics. the twists and turns of what's going on globally. It has, of course, had a big impact. As Richard just said, the COVID pandemic, of course, impacted manufacturers in terms of access to supply chains, high energy costs. I'm sure you've heard about that from other witnesses. Climate change issues affects companies in the UK as well as other countries. So in terms of how we stack up against our international competitors, we're 8th in the world in terms of global figures, which is a great place to be. I have an ambition working together with a lot of our partners to get us higher up that rankings, perhaps up to the top 3 of medal rankings as we're in an Olympic year. So that's a big aspiration. Of course, the autumn statement talked a lot about advanced manufacturing. 4.5 billion was invested. We'd love that sort of activity to perhaps come a little bit earlier because the commitment's not immediately. So that would be one thing to help support all-important manufacturing sector. I think the bigger things that are really facing us, yes, skills shortage. There's 70,000 vacancies in manufacturing at the moment which need to be filled, and about 500,000 people, I understand, not just from our sector but across the UK workforce as a whole, about 500,000 people still suffering from long COVID, so not actually back at work. So there's a lot to do in terms of putting our shoulders to the wheel and helping with skills. And then the final thing is supply chain resilience. How can we do more as a sector to help get maybe some people who are currently in one sector maybe shift away to another sector within manufacturing? So there's a lot of work being done. So my organisation is funded through Innovate UK, part of UKRI. We have a 5-year funding settlement. I have to say I would love us to have a longer settlement. I know this inquiry is looking at industrial policy and industrial strategy generally. One of the most important points, I think Richard alluded to it, is long-term strategy. We need stability, we need the infrastructure, we need the skills. So that's a key point that might be worth talking about a bit later. Thank you.
Thank you, Katherine. And Oriel, Petry, you're from a specific sector and a specific manufacturer. Your assessment on the position manufacturing is in today?
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Oriel Petry, and I'm representing here Airbus in the UK. I'm part of the UK Executive Committee. So Airbus straddles a number of sectors, civil aviation, defence. We are, in fact, in the UK, the largest satellite manufacturer, and also helicopters and cyber. We employ 12,000 people across the UK, across 25 sites. For us, we face 2 main challenges, not just in the UK, but as a global business. The first is that we have a backlog of aircraft that we need to deliver over the next few years of over 8,500. So in terms of what we need to do with ramp up, going from wing sets that are all made here in the UK from around 50 a month to 75 a month by 2026. That is the first challenge. The second challenge is that we need to produce a new generation of aircraft that is more sustainable and allows us to reach 2050 net zero. Those 2 challenges both require, in our view, a really strong industrial strategy. And for us, an industrial strategy is driven for the aim of competitiveness, UK competitiveness. And we see there are 3 areas in which the UK needs to really focus to achieve that competitiveness and for us to scale both of those challenges. The first is around the scale of the sector, because you need the heft and the weight within a sector to carry internationally. The second is around capability. Where is the innovation and the IP coming from, and who are the people that are driving that innovation and IP? And the third that has already been referred to is this international context. We are here in a globally competitive position. The UK has a great role to play, particularly across all of our sectors. But if you just take civil aviation, that is a long history. The UK is world class when it comes to our sectors. But to stay world class, this partnership between the industries that our business covers and government is absolutely critical.
I wanted to follow up the initial answers by referring to the recent reports that UK manufacturers are finding things much more competitive. Now, in your particular case, you've just told us you've got a backlog of orders, so that's hardly a massively competitive sector for you, and of course there are challenges in your principal competitor. But in terms of securing investment within your own organisation for manufacturing in the UK rather than elsewhere in the world, how does the UK stack up? How are we seen, and how are we able to secure that investment within your organisation?
Thank you. Well, as I said, the UK in our area of excellence, which is wing, is second to none. The wing expertise that we have, and also with regards to fuel systems and landing gear, is excellent. And I would say that in terms of the long-term picture that my colleagues here have talked about, we have been fortunate, particularly in civil aerospace, in that we've had a long-term partnership with the government through what is called the Aerospace Growth Partnership, which has been going since 2010. And its greatest achievement is something that Katherine and I were in the house here celebrating just last week, was the creation of the Aerospace Technology Institute 10 years ago. Now, that Aerospace Technology Institute for Airbus, but also for the broader industry, so for Rolls-Royce on engines, but also for GKN and Spirit, was able to anchor R&D here, to place the UK in a really strong position in its areas of expertise and excellence. So that is really critical in the way that we think of the UK. I would say, if I had an ask into the government, is that in space, for instance, we don't have that same clarity, that same commitment to R&D, or that long-term established relationship that we do have in civil aerospace. And in defence, we really welcome the statements that the government and actually Minister for Defence Procurement made here in the House only just before Easter around industrial capability and strategic capability being part of the procurement criteria that is set by the government. Because, of course, in defence, where the buyer is mainly government, the government has a real lever to drive that capability.
Thank you. And Katherine, Bennett, on competition, we know that there are massive incentives in the US through the programme they have there, and the EU has matched that. We're not able to come in at that kind of level, but how are we able to attract investment into manufacturing given those alternatives?
I think one of the most powerful things about the industrial strategy when it kicked off 10, 12 years ago was getting people around a table. Just like Oriel said, the Aerospace Growth Partnership was very powerful, Automotive Council, and there's other initiatives too, the construction industry as well. So that's one thing, because you can get people to leave their competitive hats at the door and they sit down and think about what's the long-term need. I have to say, business does follow business. They observe what other companies do in terms of choices of investment. That's one thing. Of course, yes, the programmes run in the EU Green Deal and the programme in the US, you're right, is a challenge. But at the same time, we have 3 of the top 10 universities in this country. By the way, Germany's got none. So there's some great assets, science and technology, and research. The quality of research in our country is absolutely excellent, and we would like to see more of bringing those organisations together. I mean, industrial policy for me is definitely a marathon, not a sprint. It needs to keep going. You need the long-term stability. You need companies in the automotive and aerospace and construction and pharmaceutical sector to feel that we're a country to invest in. Just last week I was with a potential new investor who is doing a mapping of a potential site, I'm proud to say, in the UK. So I was patting him on the back and say, what more can we do to help you? My organisation, we work closely with the Office for Investment. Often I'm asked to come and meet potential new investors and talk about the infrastructure around the support mechanisms for manufacturing. One of the key parts that perhaps is worth looking at is on a regional basis, how if you get regional organisations to really pull together and demonstrate a commitment to bringing a particular company in, that's very powerful, as you know, Mark, from your constituency. I've previously just stood down as chair of the Western Gateway, which is the powerhouse for the west of England, and there's huge momentum there trying to encourage nuclear SMR opportunities and actually work on a tidal commission there too. So I think the regional focus is good. Just a bit of a show-off statistic for you in terms of one of my centres, quite well known, AMRC in Sheffield. 20-odd years ago, that Allgrove, it was a coking works. It was a very difficult, challenging situation for the economy. Now we've got 3,500 people working there, £260 worth millions pounds worth of investment, and Boeing, sorry to say this, next to my former colleague from Airbus, but Boeing have just invested a huge amount, their biggest R&D centre outside of the US, £50 million. So regional emphasis on industrial strategy also works.
This committee visited AMRC a little while ago,
of course,
we were very impressed by what we saw. Jonathan Gullis, quickly.
Thank you, Chair. We've talked obviously a lot about the advanced manufacturing space, which is very important. Lucidian, for example, in advanced ceramics, which I'm sure has been a supply chain into Airbus or that kind of manufacturing. But we've also talked about manufacturing in general terms. My concern would be for all the great stuff that you've just announced with Bennett, the actual energy-intensive sectors in our country. That construction works with bricks, but also, and selfishly as a Stoke-on-Trent MP, you can imagine I'm going to push the ceramics agenda, because it doesn't seem to match up cleanly or neatly alongside the net zero commitments that the government aspire to, with the fact that, and ultimately, electric kilns do exist, but they only work on a certain level of quality. They're not able to fulfil the log of orders. Of course, the network grid itself is nowhere near capable of handling the power that would need to be generated for one kiln in one factory, let alone the Mach 10s and 20s that exist in some of the existing factories today. And on top of that, hydrogen is only just being explored, and ultimately, manufacturer telling me in Stoke-on-Trent, they would actually have to move to be by the sea, but have no houses in sight, because if, God forbid, that thing blew, it would cause devastation to land and communities. And of course, these manufacturers are based in the built-up areas of towns and villages across Stoke-on-Trent.
And we get to a question.
I am sorry, Chair. So my question is, isn't it fair to say that the net zero agenda is in part going to undermine those energy intensives and force a decision for this country to make about whether or not we are going to have to offshore energy intensive industries in order to meet the net zero objectives, and then allowing these kind of sectors to basically just become glorified warehouses in the United Kingdom, which will actually undermine the very manufacturing basis that we want to try and create?
Wow.
I'm happy to answer that one. So, as I said at the beginning, high energy-intensive industries are absolutely challenged, and one of the big focuses, we have 4 key areas that my Catapult are looking at, and we see, absolutely, your question is absolutely on the money. The net zero challenge is a challenge, but it's also a massive opportunity. So one of the research we've done recently with Innovate UK is 70% of manufacturers say they're not ready for the net zero challenge. So this is where my organisation is putting a lot of its attention. So I'll be happy to put in touch with your constituency company. We're working with them a lot on how to reduce the impact. Hydrogen's one answer, and actually I'm really pleased to say next week, as part of the Hydrogen Industry Initiative, which my organisation runs with other partners, we're publishing a big report. There's $1 trillion worth of opportunity in the hydrogen industry, and if we estimate if we get 10% of that, that's billions of pounds worth of income potentially for us. We're good at hydrogen. I'm not sure what you describe is completely aligned to what I've heard, but I'd love to pick up with you that later. Hydrogen is a big opportunity, and also another opportunity on clean energy. Big focus for us is on offshore renewable wind. So perhaps another opportunity working with companies in your constituency is this pivot to what I call the sunrise industries, the newer industries, which we are very well placed to help develop further on.
Thank you. Let's go to Anthony Higginbottom, please.
Thank you, Chair. Katherine, I agree entirely with one of the comments you made earlier, which is it would be great to see us go from the 8th largest manufacturer in the world to the 3rd largest. I think that's a good ambition for us. And I'm sure you and probably other panellists saw the report earlier this week from Oxford Economics and the Manufacturing Technologies Association. It was called The True Impact of UK Manufacturing, and I think it said 7.3 million jobs in the UK and about £518 billion worth of economic output of the UK. Nearly a quarter of the UK's GDP is relying on manufacturing, and so we shouldn't underestimate how important this is for the UK economy, particularly when we talk about levelling up and where is manufacturing strongest in the UK. Now, the government's got its advanced manufacturing plan, and we've taken evidence on views on that in previous sessions. I just wondered if I could start with asking your respective views on that plan. Does it properly address the global challenges that UK manufacturers are facing, particularly in line with what Mr. Gullis just said, energy-intensive industries and how we deal with energy production for those industries, for those manufacturers, doesn't seem to be covered in it. If I'll come to you, Katherine, first.
Yeah. So we have an expression that we like to use, which is green shoring. And this links in with what I said at the beginning about the supply chain resilience question, the critical issue of the supply chain being accessed to UK suppliers. So we believe that there's a huge opportunity for us to do more in this country. There's another activity my organisation does, which is helping these companies, such as in your constituencies, on measuring their carbon emissions. You might not believe it, but it's not very easy for them to measure it, and that links in with, of course, the Scope 3 requirements. But we are an island nation, so let me just turn now to offshore renewable wind. I'm very excited about this sector. There's so many opportunities. We buy a lot of energy from offshore renewable wind. It's now increasing. There's even more we can do in this country. We need to get more of those supply chain work jobs here. We have wonderful investors who are from Germany and Denmark, etc., who build wind turbines here. But the UK supply chain footprint is not large, and we're working together with my fellow Catapult, the offshore renewable Catapult, and other parts of the sector to get supply chain companies in this country to pivot more, to look at that opportunity. It's a huge opportunity, so that might be another thing. So I'm generally an optimistic person by nature. I think if we do have these councils and growth partnerships, such as Oriel and Richard have talked about, that is one way that we can get the clever brains from people around industry to put their shoulder to the wheel and say, this is what we need as a nation to develop.
Thank you. Richard, if I come to you next, what did you make of the advanced manufacturing plan?
Thanks very much. I think in short, I think the manufacturing plan is very good, but it sits within a broader context. So if you're really asking companies a holistic picture of what determines the attractiveness of the UK, I think a lot of the steps that are in that plan are excellent, particularly around capital grants, the emphasis on skills, the full expensing, as I mentioned. I think that's a really, really important step in the right direction. There are some broader factors, though, around particularly the overall attractiveness of the commercial environment in the UK, even for global industries. I think that's incredibly important. And basic things like getting the sort of single front door for companies right, if I can put it that way. So do we do the practical job of helping companies out, connect themselves to the grid, find the right part of government, for those sort of investment?
So what's the answer to that single front door, though?
So
does it exist?
I think there's been all sorts of attempts to create it over the years. I think the recent review by Lord Harrington, I think, has got some very interesting recommendations in there. So I think it's about really making sure, and what I took from that review was making sure that single front door has really got the clout across Whitehall, if I can put it that way, to sort of make sure that the right strings are being pulled at the right time. If I may just comment on the report that you mentioned as well, because I think that's a very important observation. There's a really important contribution this week to remind us all about the incredible weight and contribution that manufacturing plays in the UK economy. What I would add to that is the distinction between manufacturing and services is really blurred. When it comes to high value economic activity, often the interplay between high value manufacturing, high value services are entirely sort of interlinked. So I think that just furthers your point. Thank you.
Can I just follow up on the report, and I'll come to you, Oriel. In most explanations of the importance of UK manufacturing, the percentage of GDP they use is normally just under 10%. This report suggests it was almost a quarter. I think 23% was what it said. Why is there such a big discrepancy? Because that will impact public policy, it will impact financing. Why do you think there's such a big discrepancy between those two numbers?
Well, I mean, I read the report very rapidly yesterday, so you'll have to forgive me, and you should probably get the economists in to explain what they've done. But my understanding of it is that really it's the way in which they've calculated the induced effects on the economy. It was massively underplayed in previous methods, so it excluded things like investment in capital, which seems a little bit surprising because that feels very important for manufacturing sectors. So I think they've done a really interesting piece of work, and
you can hopefully shift the debate.
It feels credible for on the basis of a quick read.
Yeah. Oriel, if I come to you on the broader picture of the advanced manufacturing plan, and obviously your sector is one close to my own heart. Aerospace is a massive sector for us up in Burnley.
Absolutely. So from our point of view, we definitely welcomed the advanced manufacturing plan for the very simple reason that it was putting advanced manufacturing at the heart of this debate. And as Catherine's just said, we're now eighth in the world for advanced manufacturing. What we don't talk about is the fact that we've overtaken France. And so my point here is actually that in terms of the way we think about our economy, so much from a previous life, I did a lot of work with FDI investors. much of what drives international investment into the country in which we present ourselves. And the fact that, you know, the Chancellor set out an advanced manufacturing plan that spanned a challenges that we face in civil aerospace will be similar to some of the skills that we face on pharmaceuticals. And to take that broader focus is a really good thing. I think the other thing that I will add, and Chair, I'm conscious of time, the other thing that I would add is the great thing for us about the Advanced Manufacturing Plan is that it did great things for automotive, by the way, but it also really pulled out a cross-cutting issue around capital allowances. So in terms of encouraging investment and proper investment in advanced manufacturing, it did a really put forward a good policy that would make us internationally attractive. And then for civil aerospace, what the Advanced Manufacturing Plan did, which is something we've not seen before, is extend the funding for this Aerospace Technology Institute, so for the R&D. And we know that if we do the R&D in this country, the manufacturing is likely to stick beyond it. The government extended that funding to 2030, so beyond the next cycle of government finance. And the stability, and I think this has come through, hasn't it, in some of the other evidence that you've got, the stability that signals for the sector, both domestically and internationally, that aerospace is something that the UK is excellent at. The government recognises it, this House recognises it, and is going to put at the forefront, is something that is virtually sort of reinforcing. It's a positive reinforcing circle that is so important when we're talking about industrial strategy.
Can I just go to Anthony Magnon?
Just one quick follow-up. So is what I think I'm right in saying that what you're saying is it's not just important from a domestic current manufacturing base, but actually when we're looking at pulling in foreign direct investment into the manufacturing sector, it's that long-term horizon that's making the biggest, that allows us to keep growing at a faster pace than the likes of France.
Absolutely. Substance is key on policy, but so is form.
I'm going to do Anthony Magnon now, but to remind my colleagues, we do need to pick up the pace a bit here. So, Anthony.
Right, thank you very much. Firstly, Catherine, can I ask if you could just send us something on the tidal commissioner you mentioned earlier? That's something that I personally have an interest in. But can I just start by asking whether or not you think the UK has an industrial strategy?
My view on that is that there is an industrial strategy still happening because these organisations are still, the industry is still getting together. There's some sectors that don't have it though. We've had a couple of examples, the space example. We need to maybe just amplify it a little. It's all about stability and long-term planning. So, of course, in your area, you have opportunities with the free port, the marine industry. There's so many opportunities in terms of getting more manufacturing done here. As I said, the green shoring point. We had an idea and read the Harrington report about maybe getting more of a focus on industrial strategy actually in number 10. So you have 100% focus and you also have more cross-departmental review on it, which I think is sometimes there's a tendency to be siloed and you're split between different departments.
It's my running joke that when you Google in the industrial strategy, you go onto the 2017 website where it says it's archived. And one of the problems that we have with this is actually you're citing some very good alternatives, the AMP, other things, the Harrington review. These are all complementary to the things that you're trying to do. But do we need to revamp, is what I'm really asking. Do we need a new industrial strategy that is cross-party, that is long-term, that is able to get the buy-in of industry, politicians and the regional communities of the United Kingdom? Absolutely
long-term. And, I think businesses really care about this. Companies where I've worked, the employees there, the senior management there, they want to get more investors to come to circular where they are, and this is why I mentioned the example of Sheffield where you've been. And there's a very, very recent issue happening at the moment. I was honoured to be asked to sit on the transition board for Tata Steel, Port Talbot. I mean, we are facing a real situation there. An industrial strategy needs to be formed. I'm delighted that the government has put some money in there, but the green alternatives with green steel, this is all about green energy. How can we again work together? And it's a very difficult situation there. Tata Steel, a very important investor in this country, let's remind ourselves. They've also invested in Somerset recently. We need to make them feel welcome. I know there's some issues happening there at the moment, but that's all about green energy as well. So I do feel industrial strategy is needed. It needs to be a long-term plan. We need the stability, and there are many common issues as well, as we've talked about earlier.
Thank you. Just before I move on to your colleagues, can I just ask where your sort of view of the strengths and weaknesses are of the United Kingdom? And I'm sorry, I'm going to just emphasise the Chair's point on time as well. Sorry, because I've got 4 others that follow-ups on this. Thank you.
So I've talked about offshore wind opportunities, I've talked about hydrogen, we've got carbon capture and storage, green finance. The City of London is a great asset that we have. We want to get more involvement. There was just a story on the Radio 4 this morning about that. The vaccine task force, talked about a lot, but one of my centres specialises in pharmaceutical manufacturing. RNA development, what's called novel therapeutics, there's huge opportunities that was learned as a result of that. Food and agriculture is the biggest manufacturing sector we have in this country. Do we shout about that enough? I don't think we do. There's £49 billion worth of market opportunity there. And also, maybe Richard might want to touch on this, but there's opportunities in medtech as well. We can't be good at everything. We do have to focus in on where we have speciality. Some of that's aligned with existing infrastructure, and some of it's aligned with the existing university specialisms that we have.
What about the weaknesses?
So weaknesses are the challenges that we have in terms of energy costs. The weaknesses are maybe the supply chain isn't fleet of foot enough, and in the automotive sector that's been a real challenge. They're still used to sort of maybe old ways of behaving, so we need to change that. And again, I think you've probably heard from other witnesses, the challenge we have on skills is another issue, but there's momentum and things can be done to resolve that.
Thank you very much. I think Catapult shows what can be achieved. Richard, if I can just bring you in, you started off in your opening remarks talking about between 2010 and 2020 the export decline. At the risk of asking a stupid question, what caused that?
I mean, I think it was a number of factors. There is no doubt that the UK lost out on a number of manufacturing investment opportunities during that period to countries like Germany, Ireland, Singapore, etc. So it would have been a combination of that, normal market dynamics, the commercial environment here getting significantly worse during that period of time. And I think overall a lack of basic competitiveness on the sort of core fiscal comparators like the capital grants piece would be the things I would point to.
I mean, sorry, just the last follow-up and I'll hand back to you. I mean, so we are losing out in terms of competitiveness to other countries. Yeah. What can we be doing in a better way? Because is it our own domestic policy that is holding us back? Is net zero holding us back? Is our lack of it, is our high tax a problem? Is our slow growth a problem? I mean, these are, in some issues, systemic problems that need to be addressed. Are we able to actually, I mean, it's delightful to hear that we're beating the French. We're always happy to say that in Parliament. But, I mean, where are we in terms of being able to actually close that gap?
So I would say net zero, again, I'm quite sure that it's a challenge in other sectors, but I would say in this one, I think it's more of an opportunity here. I think the basic principle that we can be the home for really, really good science to improve the environmental performance of pharmaceutical manufacturing is real and credible. We want to grab those opportunities and export from them. I think we need to really make sure we have a stable commercial environment. We need to make sure we've got a well-functioning, well-resourced, high-performing regulator. We're a very highly regulated industry for good reason, and it's important that we don't have delays as a consequence of that. I do think there's been some progress on the issue of those sort of basic fiscal parameters like the sort of capital grants piece, but there is always room to make sure that we're, as a minimum, on a level playing field with the sort of countries that our companies will be sort of comparing the UK to, and we've got probably more to do on that.
I'll just bring in Jane Hunt quickly.
Thank you very much. Very exciting, all three of you, actually. Thank you very much indeed. Dr. Torbett, just very quickly, following on from what you've just said, Loughborough lost AstraZeneca site in 2011, for example, in the exact same way that you're talking about. So I was going to ask you what triggered that. We've covered that. But what would it take if you had a blank sheet of paper for big guns to come back, the AstraZenecas, if you like, to come back? And then, but perhaps more importantly, what more could we do with SMEs, spin-offs from universities perhaps? Right. What more could we do to improve their opportunities for growth? And Katherine Bennett, if you wouldn't mind me asking you about hydrogen and basically emerging technologies and emerging industries, what more can this country do to really drive that as a growth that happens within this country, please?
I'll try and give you a quick answer,
okay.
But it's a really big
I'm
question.
sorry, we do need to be quite quick, Richard.
I do need to be quick, and if you need me to follow up, I'm very happy to.
Thank you.
I think, firstly, the Loughborough example with AstraZeneca was prior, I think, to some of the changes that have been made recently. We've just had an announcement at the same time as the budget around a significant investment from AstraZeneca in Speke and in Cambridge, which I think is a sort of positive. It's very positive, right? I think we need to do more on shoring up regulation. I think we need to really deliver the life sciences vision, which we can come on to in another question if there's time. And I think we need to do more to make sure that the UK commercial environment for pharmaceuticals is competitive. Thank you.
Thank you.
On hydrogen, report next week. We'll send you a copy of it. Again, a huge opportunity. We just need those companies to maybe pivot and realise that they can actually do more in that sector as well. And there's a lot of regional interest in that as well. So happy to share more information shortly.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Andy McDonald.
Thanks, Chair. We talked about the 4.5 billion investment in strategic manufacturing sectors, 25 to 2030. And Catherine, you mentioned Tata Steel. I mean, I think the figure we're talking about there is £500 million into Tata Steel to assist with electric arc furnacing. Similarly with Jinjay Steel in the northeast. To what extent are we talking about investment here or bailouts? Because how are we going to make sure that that sort of money brings about a greater share of global markets for the UK?
That's potentially a question maybe more to ask the Minister in terms of is it a bailout? I'm involved in the Transition Board, which is the 80 million that's been allocated by the Department of Levelling Up to help the employees immediately impacted by that decision. Obviously, on the green steel opportunity that the £500 million has gone towards, many of my centres are very involved in that, and we do need to understand that the days of the blast furnace are over in terms of what's happening at Port Talbot. It's an expensive...
The days of virgin steel making in the UK are over?
Yeah, no, just in that site particularly, because it's a very old facility and they needed to make change and rapid improvements. So the Transition Board, which as I was talking about, is more how we can help the employees affected, but also that's an important site. There's a free port there, working closely with the Swansea Bay City deal, whether we can have more clean energy work brought into there as well, and that's one thing that the Transition Board's looking at.
Okay, so how do we compare as a nation in terms of our investment in advanced manufacturing? How does it compare with our competitors?
So in terms of China and US, of course, they're huge superpowers. We have a lot of investment that goes in. I mean, my Catapult is one part of that. There's other sources of investment too. But in terms of regional funding, maybe there's much less. The Fraunhofer Institute, on which is based in Germany, on which the Catapult concept was based, they have huge amounts of funding. They've been going since the 50s. In other countries also put a lot more investment into not only manufacturing but also R&D. So Korea, Australia, Singapore, they have much longer term funding opportunities. So I think that's something, as I said earlier, we could maybe suggest looking at a sort of longer cycle of that. As Oriel said, the ATI funding was a significant step forward in terms of long term. I mean, there's some other stats I could share with you. Robots, we're not that strong on robots in this country. We need more investment in robotics.
Do we learn anything from Hitachi? Because that was, you talked about regional successes, people coming together. That was evidence of that happening. And yet we're finding that sector in grave difficulties. What do you learn from that sort of experience in terms of that, long-term view?
Are you talking about rail or nuclear?
Rail.
Rail, okay.
Yeah.
Not an area I'm that familiar with, I'm afraid.
But it's advanced manufacturing.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that hasn't been sustained in terms of integrated policy.
There are a number of factors that companies have to go through when they're considering about continuing with investment or also developing more. So there's, I can't comment particularly on the Hitachi situation, but the most important thing for me is, as I said, shoulders behind the wheel, all demonstrate that we want companies to invest. We have the capabilities, we have some opportunities, and the net zero one, as we've said already, is a big opportunity.
So in terms of working together, what were the discussions that were had with government before the announcement of the 4.5 billion? Were you engaged in those discussions prior to announcement?
I know there was a lot of consultation with industry. I mean, I was quite blown over, to be honest, by the figures that were announced in the autumn statement. Very welcome, as has been mentioned here. The capital expenses issue was very welcome, and the emphasis on skills too. But there's always more that can be done.
And given that level of investment, which is very considerable, what should the taxpayer expect in return in terms of equity or other dividends, if I can describe it in that broader way?
I can assure you, when it's money allocated to, say, the Aerospace Technology Institute or support for organisations such as the Advanced Propulsion Centre, which is the key thing for automotive, impact and measurement is absolutely name of the day. My life is spent absolutely demonstrating value for money. There's a lot of measurement, a lot of surveys with companies about the benefits, and we hear that a recent report said that people who've worked with Catapults, they're very much more likely to invest more because of the work they've done with our organisations. So it's always an absolute priority question about measurement of that impact, of that cost.
And then just finally, Oriel, you mentioned the Aerospace Technology Institute, and they told us that the UK could grow its share of the global aerospace market from 13 to 18% by 2050 with the right support. Is that level of growth the UK can expect for the sums it's going to be invested? Is that the sort of return we can expect?
It is certainly, we agree with that as a benchmark. If I may just add to what Katherine said, I do think the UK is very good at public support for R&D. I think across advanced manufacturing, and where Katherine's organisation is so key, is pulling that public investment at the start through to commercialisation. And I think particularly for us, and if I go back to our civil aerospace kind of challenge that I set out before, both on the ramp up, which is driven by more sustainable fuel-efficient aircraft at the moment. That's why we've got these big numbers, but also our ambition to have a new generation of our aircraft, again, more sustainable, and a hydrogen-fueled aircraft by 2035. That pull through to commercialisation is something that the UK struggles with. I'm not saying it particularly, it's a difficult challenge across developed nations, but I think one of the things that we identify, we have a supply chain of about 3,000 overall, 2,000 on the defence side, 3,000 on civil, and what our supply chain tells us, and we need that supply chain to be agile and to be resilient, and what our supply chain tells us is that it is difficult for them because our timelines are so long, and because the upfront investment is so large, they do find it difficult to raise capital. Yes. So in terms of pulling through this public spending, we definitely see a challenge, and there may be an opportunity, given that London remains this centre of financial prowess, to look again at how the financial sector can work with advanced manufacturing, really to pull through that investment at the front. And it may be, as we've said, the capability sits here. It may be that if we get that right, that the return that the government sets out there could be greater.
Nicholas, please.
Thank you, Chair. I want to turn to key vulnerabilities in the supply chain that UK-based advanced manufacturers rely on. Dr. Torbett, turning to the pharmaceutical sector in particular, we've seen a number of shortages of key medicines in recent years, including a current chronic shortage of medication for ADHD, which is causing misery for my constituents, many of whom have been left very vulnerable as a result of this. When I've raised this with the Secretary of State for Health, her response was that the government couldn't wave a magic wand to resolve the supply chain problems. And while on a very literal reading of her remarks, that's true, do you think there is more they could be doing as UK government? And if so, what?
So I think you've raised an extremely important point. I mean, there is nothing more distressing than the patient impact of medicines not being available. You've identified one of those examples in ADHD, and there are a couple of others that are very acute at the moment, and I think it's extremely important that the right level of collaboration takes place between everybody involved. That means manufacturers, it means wholesalers, it means the National Health Service, and of course the government. We need to do as much as we possibly can to predict demand. We need to do as much as we possibly can through things like the international trade agreements, multilateral agreements, bilateral agreements, to ensure there's really good movement of goods around the world. From a longer term perspective, from a manufacturing angle, if I can kind of connect the two conversations, clearly we want to make sure that the UK is the most attractive place as possible to manufacture here, but equally we have to be realistic that we can't manufacture everything. So we really need that level of collaboration, demand forecasting, and sort of global framework in place to minimise any risk of the sort you're talking about.
Thank you. Ms Bennett, as chair of the UK Task and Finish Group on Industry Resilience for Critical Minerals, how confident are you that UK manufacturers can rely on a stable and secure supply of critical minerals?
Yeah, the Task and Finish Group was a fascinating thing to be part of. We had lots of different industry sectors sitting around the table and looking at what rare earths they use, where they access those materials, and there are a lot of challenges. So a lot of the supply comes from China, from Russia, and of course, for understandable reasons, they're not countries that we're currently able to import much on. Again, we saw opportunities. There's opportunities in Cornwall, for example, on lithium. Many of the electric vehicles and washing machines use permanent magnets, and there's issues about accessing those. So one of the things that we came up with was we did a bit of a landscape review about where we all are, and there was a lot of commonalities between sectors, which was helpful. And so my report was sent to the Department of Business and Trade, and the Minister will be responding to that. Some response has already been done. But actually, what I did find around the table was a huge desire for closer collaboration across a number of sectors. So this is a helpful point in terms of industrial policy work overall. Yes, you need the individual sectors within manufacturing to work together, but there are a lot of cross-cutting themes as well, and critical minerals is one of those.
Thank you. And turning to some remarks that you made earlier, Dr. Torbett, around new drug discovery and how important this is in the British pharmaceutical sector, and some of the points that have been raised about us not necessarily having the most joined-up approach to industrial strategy across Whitehall, I'd like to ask what impact the Home Office licensing and scheduling regime under the Misuse of Drugs Act has on research and development within the pharmaceutical sector.
If I may, given the specificity of that question, would you allow me to write to you with a proper answer for that? Because I would need to be cited on the detail.
Yes, I'd be very pleased to do so. Thank you.
Thanks. Ian Lavery, please.
Thanks, Chair. Looking back to the government's 2017 industrial strategy, which Mr Mangnall's said has already been archived, and as normally took my question rather. But that's bothered by. But looking back at the 2017 industrial strategy, what lessons do you think the government can actually learn from that industrial strategy? What worked well? What perhaps could have worked better? And how has the government approach to the industrial strategy actually changed since 2021, when they basically archived the industrial strategy of 2017?
Let me have a go. I'll kick off. I was in a major international company at the time, and it was incredibly important for the UK government to be putting its best feet forward in terms of a strategy. Many other countries do the same, and many other investors were calling for it. So the benefit, of course, as I said, was getting companies around a table. So that worked well. The industrial strategy was published. There were various different sector parts of that. The other important thing is there's new sectors now emerging that we need to get strategies on. And as I said earlier, the industrial strategy in many ways is still alive and kicking, so it's done a good thing. It's set up some very good organisations. But the other thing to say, and how our economy has developed, there's also horizontal work that can be done. I haven't mentioned digital this morning. Digital, AI, again, many companies in our sector need to use more of that technology, and there's lots of initiatives such as working with organisations such as the Turing Institute. I think it could do with being revamped again. We need to see a focus on it again. It really helps when I'm out trying to sell our country as a place for companies to invest in and talk about the opportunities of my centres and how we can help investors. It needs a new review, potentially, a bit more focus on it. And very importantly, sorry if I keep talking about offshore renewable wind, but we need the different government departments to work together in a more strategic way. For example, the Department of Net Zero does a lot on renewable wind, but it doesn't mandate that some of the supply chain should be from the UK. So that's the kind of thing that I could think would work well on a horizontal basis.
Just while you're on, Ms. Bennett, you mentioned, I think you recommended that the government establish an industrial policy unit number 10. What was the thinking behind that?
It's exactly that.
Exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, get a bit more of a laser focused on working together across manufacturing as a whole, whether that's Department of Health, which obviously Richard knows more about, but other government departments too.
Dr. Torbett?
Just a very quick compliment specifically for the life science industry, if I may. We were one of the first sectors post-2017 to have a sector-specific industrial strategy, which did some, I think, really good things, including in manufacturing. To answer your question, I think the things that were missed at that time were primarily the importance of the link between the economic activity that the industry does in this country and collaboration with the NHS. 5 years after 2017, we have the Life Sciences Vision, which is a sort of refreshed version of that document, which has done two things. Firstly, it's re-emphasised partnership with the NHS, whether it's in clinical trials and sometimes on manufacturing, is incredibly important. The second thing is it takes the so-called sort of mission-oriented approach. So what it's tried to do is identify some societal goals like dementia, like cancer, like addiction, around which the innovation in the industry can really help society and grow the economy at the same time. And if you can hook the industrial policy around those societal missions, you can hopefully achieve multiple purposes. We can support the NHS better, and we can try and generate the sort of economic activity that can grow manufacturing, research and exports here as well. So that's the goal.
I mean, is it right that the industrial strategy, 2017 industrial strategy, has been shelved? If it's been shelved, is that a positive thing? Is it a negative thing?
So I was specifically for the life science industry. It evolved into something called the Life Science Vision. So I wouldn't read too much into the labelling change personally. What matters is the core underlying drive to focus on high value, R&D based missions is still there, and that's still a live document and it's still being implemented. But we'd like to see it being implemented quicker.
The government's. What is the government's approach in your view to industrial policy at this moment in time?
Well, I think, and I hope this came through clearly, I think from our point of view in civil aerospace, we think these issues of scale, capability and the global context are reflected in what the relationship that we have, both in the Aerospace Growth Partnership, which is the industry government forum, but also in the Aerospace Technology Institute that's putting money from industry and government into IP that's going to be delivered here in the UK, and therefore we expect to be commercialised here. I think I would add one thing. The challenge we face, and Catherine's referred to it really, is this pivot. And the drive for this backlog is needing to get to net zero. And so in addition to an industrial strategy that is looking at ensuring that the supply chain is resilient, ensuring that it's properly funded, ensuring that we have the right skills, ensuring that we're projecting that strength internationally, the other piece for us is that we have a regulatory framework that allows us to have enough sustainable aviation fuel to reduce our carbon emissions, and I think that is a big debate that we are having, and actually hydrogen again is going to be critical. So again, the UK is in a great position to leverage that change, but also longer term when it comes to hydrogen, there are a number of questions that we need to put in place from an infrastructure position and from a regulatory position, all of which then adds to that picture around competitiveness. And it illustrates well that it's not just about anchoring the industry here, but it's also creating the right environment for new industries to develop. So I think that may be the next sort of step in us developing this. And at the moment, that's slightly split across Whitehall. And I suppose making sure that those things are pulled together is really important.
Ian, we do need to move on if that's okay.
I'm fine with
Okay, I know Douglas Chapman just wanted to come in on this question.
Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks for all the information today. I mean, you'll realise that we've taken quite a lot of evidence so far. One of the previous people sitting in your chair was Lord Mandelson, and he described the UK as being in a dreadful hole in terms of industrial strategy and potential for further growth. And that was based around the lack of coherence, the lack of alignment and consistency in policy, that constant revolving door of ministers and staff within departments, and the dearth of a long-term vision. So with that in mind, it sounds like a recipe for failure, but you've given us some examples of successes today as well, which has been really good. But we're nearly at an election, so what sort of lessons and what should an incoming government of whatever shade, colour or whatever, when that government comes in, what should it be doing to really reset the industrial strategy dials? And I'd like to say something, if you can, just about two areas I'm really interested in. One would be on SMEs, because while a global strategy is fantastic, some smaller companies, maybe 20 employees or something, don't see that global picture. So maybe something on SMEs and something on skills as well, which I think we've got real issues in terms of the skills landscape at the moment. So how do we actually fix some of these issues, and how would an incoming government fix some of these issues? It won't be my responsibility, but it'd be interesting to hear what your views are.
Okay, if okay. For me, shoulder to the wheel, I said that already, but it's getting the best foot forward, promoting manufacturing. We are 8th in the world. We want to go higher. We have fantastic universities. We have some fantastic companies, large and small, who are in manufacturing. But this net zero challenge is a challenge, but it's also an opportunity. And I think any incoming government would focus on that. So obviously, the Scottish Government has a big policy of supporting manufacturing as well. So our centre up at Renfrewshire, National Manufacturing Institute for Scotland, was a joint investment from the Scottish Government and from my organisation. They're really specialise in forging these huge, large scale structures needing for companies such as Rolls-Royce and Boeing, etc. So, and the nuclear industry is another key opportunity. So for me, a future government is best foot forward. Yes, there's been some ministers who've changed, but a lot of the officials actually in that department have stayed. There are some who were there in other companies I worked at and now here. So the officials are high quality and we deal with them. Ministers have always been pretty supportive. I mean, Lord Harrington, when he was Trade Minister, really flew the flag and he's never stopped. And I know he appeared in front of your committee as well. In terms of SMEs, so since my Catapult's been in existence since 2011, we've worked with 30,000 companies and 57% of them are SMEs. And they come to us because they can learn from other SMEs, because we do a lot of convening. As I said earlier, they can come and use our equipment, which are national assets. We're open access centres. And, there's a real effort and we're really measured, I can assure you, we're really measured hard on the work we do with SMEs.
Thank you. Oriel?
So I would say there's a great, I think, and that's come through, hasn't it? There's a great foundation here. I mean, I think I would leave the committee with this idea that civil aerospace, there was a moment in 2010 where where a vision was developed. And I think that is a model that could be replicated, particularly for the other sectors that we operate in. We would love to see it in space. I would say in defence, where the government is the market creator, this idea of really making sure that procurement is not just looking at cost, but is looking at the development of IP in quite a focused way is really important. And the challenge that we see here is that for the Minister to make a statement around 50% social value is the way that the Ministry of Defence sort of terms it, for that to pull through into the actual procurement, we haven't quite seen that yet. So I think that's a key opportunity. And then I think, Catherine, it may seem like a small point that Catherine's making, but again, in civil, we have had the same official since 2015. And he was praised last week when we were celebrating the Aerospace Technology Institute. But there is something about the longevity of him and really understanding and having built expertise that we have also benefited from, and we could see pull through into the Treasury's advanced manufacturing plan. So that stability, which is unusual in Whitehall, is something that any new government could encourage.
Douglas, may we just draw this one session to a close?
I just have one short question. Maybe Richard could maybe take this last one. And it's going back to a comment that was made by Farine Khan, who's with Make UK, is the senior economist there. Yes. And he said we can't go on business as usual. We need to, if you're serious about long-term growth, then we need to address the industrial strategy issue. And he suggests that that's a matter of national urgency. So I think my first question would be, is anybody listening to that message? And secondly, do you see it as being urgent? Are we falling behind other competitors too fast and not being able to recapture bits of the market that we should actually be excelling in?
I mean, look, it's a very broad question. I would say it is urgent because we want the UK to be a prosperous, successful economy, and we have a real productivity crisis and have had for a number of years, which has got worse. So we need to have a very smart way of doing the things that are most likely to grow the economy in the most equitable way across the country that we can.
Is it urgent?
I'd say it's urgent sector-wise, but also remind ourselves about the benefits of working horizontally as well on such things as AI, digital, etc.
May I just thank our witnesses for the session. We're running rather behind. I just want to pick up a couple of things that were said, which was the bit about the UK being great at providing support for R&D through our universities, the challenge being to get that to commercialisation. That's exactly the role of the catapults, which Catherine's told us about. Catherine, also you said we can't be good at everything, and there is a good reason for us to focus on where our specialities lie. And then Oriel, thank you for reminding us that we're the 8th biggest manufacturer and we've overtaken France. Thanks very much. Order.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
The proceeding is currently suspended. 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 The proceeding is currently suspended.
5-4. May I extend a welcome to our second panel in our session, and I think each of you are listening to the first panel. I'm sorry we overran a bit on manufacturing, probably because that's about making things that people can physically see, and we've got some experts in the field of services here, which are less tangible but nonetheless massively important to our trade situation and our employment and the nature of our economy. Our first question is with Ian Lavery.
Thanks, Chair. Just a simple one at the very beginning. How was the global competitive landscape in your industries operating? How are they changing? And what's the face of the change? Start with
I'm happy to go first. So just to say, I'm James Palmer. I'm a lawyer, former chair of a law firm. I've been advising international investors for 38 years into coming into the UK, and I'm specifically chair of the UK City UK Legal Services Group. So in the legal sector, but my comments I think relate to financial and professional services to an extent as well. I think the competitive landscape is very competitive. I mean, we've got a fantastic position for the legal services. We're the second biggest legal services sector globally. The US is the largest by far, but actually in terms of international legal work, we're probably the number one for cross-border. And that is a reflection of the very high quality of the judiciary. So continued investment in the courts is very, very important for us. But it's also a reflection of something that has not been widely noted, which is billions of pounds of investments by global law firms in building international networks, which wasn't ever capitalized. It just went through profit and loss accounts. But has been a huge investment in building that. I would say that it's actually a good thing that the quality of justice in many countries around the world is improving, not everywhere obviously, but in a number of countries, and we shouldn't regret that, but it means the quality of competition is greater. And I think that as other countries develop their services systems and realize what a strong is more and more intense, I mean, I think we do still have a fantastic opportunity as global leaders in the professional services area, including law, but I think that position is under threat, and there are some very important challenges for us to acknowledge and face up to in protecting it, which maybe we can come back to.
At Phoenix Group, we're the country's largest long-term savings and pensions retirement company, with 280 billion that we're looking after on behalf of 12 million customers, predominantly in the UK through brands like Reassure, Phoenix Life and Standard Life. In terms of the UK competitive environment, we see a huge and growing need, which is predominantly driven by one of the grand challenges identified in the previous industrial strategy, the ageing of our society, where people have not saved enough for retirement, are predominantly not getting enough advice. So we see a growing and robust market, but we're also a global investor. One of the important changes we've seen to the competitive landscape over the last few years, particularly post-Brexit, are reforms to Solvency II and Solvency UK, which could enable the insurance sector to invest another £100 billion into infrastructure, sustainable and productive assets. And then more recently, where we've played a key role, the Mansion House Compact, which looked to increase the quantity of investment into unlisted equity, so venture capital and private equity, that comes from pension funds. So we think that could lead to a fundamental shift in the way that our capital markets operate that will in turn shift the competitive landscape of the UK quite drastically.
Okay. Well, I think I'll move on to the next question, because if we get a lengthy answer from everybody, we're going to be here till next Tuesday. So can I just, I'll ask Ms. Jones, what are the main drivers of growth in your sector? And then I'll ask you the same question.
Yeah, if I can jump in. So hi everyone, thanks for inviting me. I'm Shira Jeczmien. I'm the founder and CEO of Screenshot Media. We're a next-gen media and content business. We create content to 18 to 25-year-olds, specifically with news and entertainment. I'm here to speak sort of on behalf of the creative sector. I would say that from a national and international level, the creative sector is very much a success story. We're currently employing, creating jobs at 3 times the average rate in the UK. And we're also exporting 46 billion of goods and services annually. However, I would say the main issue that we're facing at the moment is that we are lacking development funding in the country. And that's essentially causing us to, companies within the creative sector, to move to the UK, to move to Canada, to move to other countries where they can seek this investment. Also, what we're seeing is that foreign investment is taking up bigger and bigger equity in our UK creative businesses or buying us straight out. So I would say that this is a massive issue and a massive focus.
Jones?
Thank you. So I'm Sally Jones. I'm the trade strategy leader at EY. I'm going to assume you all know who EY is and not waste your time on that. competitive landscape has changed enormously over the past 20 to 30 years. It used to be straightforward. It used to be we're competing with the US, Europe and Japan. Now there are all kinds of other economies which are coming in, and no one country can rest on its reputation and past successes, and that includes the UK. So we need to be nimble, and we need to recognise that there are increased threats in the sense of other countries that are just as investable as we are in many regards. For our sector of professional services, we are at the absolute forefront of the transition from a manufacturing-based economy to a services-based economy. We rise and fall as the general economy rises and falls, and so probably the biggest threat for us has been stagnant growth. That said, our economic forecasts that our chief economist pulls together shows that there are some positive signs in the future. I think that there is moderate economic growth expected over the next 3 years, but London and the South East are going to take a disproportionate share of it because of the disproportionate way that the industries are spread throughout the country, and that need to, excuse a political term, I know it won't resonate with all of you, but to level up, to make sure that the regions enjoy the same economic prosperity that London and South East does, is probably the single biggest issue that our sector faces.
Thanks for that. In 2022, global services exports were valued at $7.1 trillion. And the UK is the second largest exporter of services globally, behind the US. China's just behind in third place. I think the US service exports were valued at $929 billion, whilst the UK service exports were valued at $429 billion. And as I say, China was just behind that. How confident would each of you be, in a 30-second answer, that the UK can retain basically second position? Mr. Palmer?
Cautiously confident if we are not complacent.
Thanks.
I'd agree with that answer. I think if we get our regulatory regime right and play that correctly into the international fora, we can maintain that position.
Ali?
I don't trust the numbers. Frankly, trade and services data is really badly collated, to the point where we think we're net exporters to the US and they think they're net exporters to us in services. So actually, before we worry too much about whether we're second, third or fourth, I think we need to do a much, much better job at collating that information so that we actually know the baseline we're starting from.
Very interesting. Shira?
I think I would just second Sally as well, and nothing else to add to that.
That's a very interesting answer about not trusting the figures. Yeah, the figures that we've got, and I think we've got as a committee got to work by. But it's a very interesting answer, that. But that's fine, Chair.
Anthony
thank you, and I'm going to start where you've just finished off, Sally, which is how do we measure it better? And given the fact that we were on a joint panel together where we may have made the same argument on this, what do we need to do to trust the numbers?
We need to... So let's start with how the numbers are currently collated, which is a survey of a very narrow number of services firms, which are then grossed up on the assumption that they're representative of the whole of the services economy. I'm the chair of the Professional and Business Services Council. We represent 45 different organisations. When we asked them how many of them were being asked to contribute to the survey, the answer was 2. The law firm Freshfields and a small management consultancy firm. It's not representative. We need to do better. Our suggestion, which we've put to the Secretary of State, is that we should be using the VAT system to collect much more robust figures. The VAT system used to be used to collate trade and services statistics before we left the EU. The boxes on which that data was collected remain on the VAT form. It's just they're not currently being used for anything. We would reinstate that.
Okay, thank you very much. James, can I come to you, please, which is, you started off in your opening remarks, sorry, I've got a cold, as you can probably tell. You started off in your opening remarks talking about the competition we're facing from other countries. How much is the City of London now suffering as a result of that competition?
I think it's always affected by competition, and I think we have to be realistic that competition is going to continue, and it's not going to lighten up. And I think it comes back to, so what do we do about it, and what are the concrete choices? And I think one of the things I would urge, having found the first session very interesting and being very supportive of us finding areas of manufacturing to grow in, but is, to be honest, I think services does fly under the radar in terms of focus on investment, and for us as an economy, which given it is 80% of the economy on most of the data, I think is a shame. And I think that in a way, a lot of what happens in services, certainly in the professional services area, doesn't need loads of government action. Actually, our biggest challenges are about, ironically, something that helps Sally's profession and mine, the burgeoning regulation and constant changes of intervention, which we make money out of, but are a cost for the economy. And, you know, we wonder why we have a productivity challenge, but actually the constant requirement for business leaders to focus on changing rules all of the time is a huge distraction. And certainly in my career, it's 30 years ago I first got involved in that, the time devoted to that has just exploded.
I'm going to bring Tim in a second on the sort of the regulatory regime and what we would expect to see, but can I just push you then? What are other countries offering that make us look as though we're behind the times? I mean, you're absolutely spot on about the 80% point of our financial services, and actually I think the only press that we're really seeing at the moment around this is companies not deciding to list on the stock exchange and going elsewhere as a result. So what are other countries, those who are either previously historically bigger than us or are now emerging markets, what are they doing that looks more tantalising?
The good news is in the professional services sector and financial services, that while there are some granular things going on, I don't think they have, you know, deep strategies around it, other than some jurisdictions in Europe around financial services, and Singapore would be another example. I do think that the recent recognition on financial services in the UK that we have got an issue is very positive, and I think it's not just about helping the city and investment. I think we need to start with how do we help, and it's the point Tim alluded to, how do we help actually create great savings for pensioners, for ordinary people through the country where we do not have the pensions to fund their retirements. And it's an intergenerational issue here. And I think this is a tough issue to address, but it is fundamental to unlocking capital for investment in the UK. We have the lowest proportion on most of the measures I've seen of our pension savings invested in the UK in equity investments for long-term returns. If we can have some shifts in that, the transformative investment capacity for the UK is unbelievable. So I think that's a real upside area.
I'm delighted you've dropped Tim in this to answer and find all the solutions. But just can I ask you two quick points that I'll hand back to you, Chair, which is, Tim, since you suggested that we need to change the regulatory regime or there are alternatives, what are they? And then the second point to just finish where James finished, on pension funds and unlocking them. The government sort of suggested there are things that we could do. They've even created new bodies to push this, to see where we could encourage sort of greater sort of investment within the UK. And obviously the spring budget saw a little bit of movement in that area. What more can we do on pension funds? Have we done enough? And what would your recommendations be?
Absolutely, thank you for those questions. On the regulatory front, we have ended up post-Brexit with sort of three types of regulatory regime that interact. We have product-based regulation from the EU. We have process and services-based regulation, which has been the traditional UK approach. And now we have principles-based regulation. And the principles-based regulation, longer term, is likely to be the most flexible, the most future-proof, and enable the most innovation in companies to deliver the right outcomes for our customers. So dealing with the slightly messy regime that we have left, I think will be critical to that simplification. One very helpful step is the new secondary objectives to financial competitiveness and growth. And I think we've been pleased to see both our financial services regulators, the PRA and the FCA, take that very seriously, and would like to see that continue. And I think that will help in terms of the regulatory regime. In terms of international trade, I think there is an opportunity to give our economic regulators an objective to support trade deals, because trade in services is predominantly about regulatory alignment and regulatory agreements rather than traditional tariffs and quotas. So there is a role, making explicit the role of regulators in boosting trade could be helpful. In terms of pension fund investment in the UK, we've been delighted to play a key role in the changes to Solvency UK, the Mansion House Compact. We were the funder behind both of the successful LIFTS bid, the long-term investment in technology and science, alongside our partners ECG and Schroders. We think there is more that can be done. These changes will have a significant impact. At the risk of getting too technical, within Solvency UK, we believe an asset sandbox could increase the number of assets that are available for insurance company to invest in. I'm very happy to write to the committee on more detail on that. We need to drive consolidation. We currently have 27,500 pension trusts in the UK. In Australia, that number's closer to 50. So a smaller number of bigger funds are likely to invest more in productive ways, more innovative ways. And finally, to James's point, there is just a quantum issue. Right now, automatic enrolment minimums are 8%. Defined benefit pensions, if you price the teachers' scheme at the moment, I was looking at that this morning, that's 35% of salary. There is just, if we want to maintain net investment flows, we need to increase the amount we're saving in the UK, because growth requires productivity, productivity requires investment, investment requires savings. Luckily, there is a win-win available there, because the vast majority of people are not saving enough for their retirement. So we think it's absolutely critical, probably for the next government, to start laying out a roadmap for increases in pension contributions to both protect savers and drive investment through the economy.
I wonder if I could just ask about the issue of mobility of the people providing services. So manufacturing declined because manufacturing went to areas of lower wages. Particularly in creative, Shira, that can be done anywhere in the world, can't it? We visited Korea and we saw how fast their creative sector is growing. Why should people continue to seek what you provide based in the UK rather than elsewhere around the world? And I do get Sally's point that if a UK national were to be doing that for a UK company elsewhere in the world, where does that end up in the figures? But what's to prevent it going wherever around the world, as we've got technology that enables people to work from anywhere?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I think, first of all, it's good to look at the landscape of UK creativity and just generally the creative sector. Half of young Brits currently want to be content creators and want to work in the creative industry. We're sort of bursting at the seam as an industry, and we're incredibly good at exporting IP and talent. It's always been in our DNA. I think that the UK is very much a world leader in leading in innovation. But again, it does bring me back to the point that is, the creative industry really needs more specialist development funding so that people don't go elsewhere, so that we maintain it within the UK shores. I think, the clear issue is that getting access to that early stage funding in the UK, if you're in the creative sector, is so incredibly difficult. But as I mentioned, we're ripe with ideas and innovation and R&D, and we're really bursting at the seams despite having very little enablers to do so.
Tell us why this funding requirement is so important. I mean, all you need is lots of ideas and a computer, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, you could say that, but at the same time, you need to develop IP, develop creativity, invest in skills, in various skill sets. As AI is taking over, that's allowing actually individuals to become even more innovative.
Is that a requirement for more formal training? Is that the...
Go. I've got 3 boys, and they all want to be YouTubers, and they've all decided that whichever one gets to 1 million subscribers first will invite his brothers.
They'll all go and work.
They're going to be hopeless. They're going to be absolutely hopeless. But that point you're making about skills is so critical, because the creative industries, the professional industries, financial services, we are all highly, highly skilled industries. All we are is people and ideas.
Yes.
And we've talked a little bit about IP protection, and one of the reasons that the UK is a great place to do these things is because we've got a really strong IP regime. It needs a bit of an update for AI and tech, but it's coming. The government's working on it. But we really need to invest in the domestic workforce to make sure people do have the skills that they need going forward. And you blithely say the creative industry is people and a laptop, but we all know that if we put me or you in front of a laptop, we would not generate.
I wouldn't have the creative ideas.
Exactly, but we need to give people the skills domestically to do that. We need to make sure that it's we have a regime where those skills are being fostered from primary school upwards. Across the whole of the piece, business skills, financial services skills, creative thinking, critical thinking, and that does require investment, exactly as Shira says. Sorry, I'm a bit passionate about that.
I would just also add to you before we move on to that is that retaining IP currently in the country is a real issue, and it's an issue across all subsectors of the creative industry. So from film, TV, gaming, media, and of all scales, so from SMEs all the way to large-scale companies. I know of a company in the UK, a national treasure, if you may, that's currently struggling to raise 50 million to continue to develop and grow in its world-renowned IP. And that is a massive issue that we're facing, that we're essentially selling off the IP overseas, largely to the US, as I mentioned, but also China and elsewhere in Europe, and not benefiting from the long tail of retaining IP within our shores.
And Tim, the services that your firm provides, could they be provided from anywhere in the world?
So most of the services that we provide, you would need a core in the UK because we interact with the UK tax regime, we interact with the UK regulatory regime. There are elements of our services that are provided globally, both on the investment side and also in the administration side, but we don't see that as a problem for the UK. That's one of the things that enables us to offer our customers the best possible price and the best possible product. So ensuring that the right activity is taking place in the UK with sensible outsourcing is going to lead to the best outcome for UK consumers.
Okay, and James, outsourcing of legal services?
So outsourcing of legal services, I think, will happen with AI to a greater degree, but we've also outsourced from London to other parts of the region. So 10, 15 years ago, we opened in Belfast, high skill, high quality workforce, recruiting great skilled graduates out of Queen's and other universities in Belfast. I think that we are already a global business. We already outsource certain things to other jurisdictions, but actually the UK is still our largest location, and it's by far our largest export location. And I think the ability to have low cost in certain parts of what we provide is part of why we're able to export and provide a more comprehensive service. Is there a
trend in more being delivered overseas?
So I think more of the mid-skill, if I can call it that, work is being delivered in other jurisdictions. We have UK lawyers all around the world as well, but the core is still here, and the largest proportion of cross-border flow is still coming to the UK.
Thank you. Douglas?
Yes, thanks very much, Chair. The Resolution Foundation and the LSE Centre for Economic Performance has argued that the services specialism areas can form the bedrock of growth strategy in the UK. I'd like to know what level do you agree with that statement, and what would that actually look like in terms of your own sectors, on how we could actually develop what you're already doing and make it a stronger sector that could compete more globally. And Shira, you've mentioned about investment skills and IP. Is there anything else that you think should be in that mix? If the government were looking at an industrial strategy for the future, what would the cultural and creative sector actually be looking for?
Yeah, so again, not to repeat myself too much, but early stage specialist development funding and greater investment in that. For example, in organizations like Creative UK, who has the skill set and the knowledge and the expertise to sort of not fall for the myth that we're a high-risk sector, because in reality this is simply not true. But I would also sort of second what Sally mentioned around investing in young people and in young talent. I think a really good example that I can give you from our own experience from Screenshot Media is that Our business might actually not be here today if it wasn't for the Kickstart program that was launched in 2020 in COVID. So it took a national crisis or an international global crisis to actually create a program for a business like ours that helped us scale. We were very young at the time, just a couple of individuals, and we were able to hire young talent individuals that were eager to kickstart their career. For those of you who sort of don't know, maybe just generally, it was subsidizing 3 days of work at national minimum wage for 6 months. That allowed us to hire about 15 individuals and scale our business organically to what it is today. And many of those initial Kickstarters are actually still working with us today in sort of, senior roles in the company.
And that kind of intervention is really important for a lot of SMEs as well, in terms of giving them that step up.
Certainly. So I would say, why does it need to take sort of a global crisis for a program like that to take place? And I know of many SMEs that have also benefited from that. So I would sort of encourage the committee to look at solutions and programs like this.
In your neck of the woods and your industry, what would you say would be of value from a government intervention point of view or industrial strategy that might
we have the privilege, and I think James would probably see it in a similar way, of being able to take a view of the whole of the economy, because our clients represent the whole of the economy, so we can understand quite well what's working and what isn't. And it seems to me that one of the problems we have right now is that we are trying to be everything to everybody, and we're spreading ourselves too thin, like butter spread on too much toast. And actually what we need to do is to pick those high growth sectors. And actually, I think the Chancellor got it broadly right when he picked digital and life sciences and creative and so I forget what the 5 were, but they were green services was one. He was broadly advanced manufacturing, got them, all 5. He was broadly right with those. But one of the problems we have, and Anthony, you asked earlier, do we have an industrial strategy? And my answer to that is actually no. What we've got at the moment is some little pieces of very well-formed strategy around advanced manufacturing or semiconductors or resilient supply chains or whatever it might be. But they're like baubles without a Christmas tree to hang upon. And actually what we need is the Christmas tree. And once we've got the Christmas tree, that's the holistic approach that's cutting across the departments and across the parties, then the whole of the economy can grow based on those growth sectors, including ours, and from there, the productivity will flow.
Tim, what does your Christmas tree look like?
I think in terms of things we haven't covered already, I think developing a clearer investment pipeline, and what I mean by that particularly is infrastructure and net zero transition. We have a huge pool of capital, and as a driver of growth, it's available. There's actually not enough projects to invest in at the moment, particularly on green transition. But there's huge need. We know that in terms of both housing, infrastructure and transition. So building the pipeline between the capital, and that is going to be critical to enable growth in the economy, but also to allow the investment sector to grow. The other area I would highlight, which is of particular interest of us, is the response to the ageing society. Right now, we have not really fully grasped and embraced the scale of change that is going to come for UK society, both in terms of the macroeconomics, but also how it will culturally shift. So identifying things like how we embrace longer working lives, how we embrace a population with potentially more ill health, more caring needs, that will be absolutely critical to a successful 21st century economy.
Okay,
so if I can just add on those points, I mean, I think that this point about the strategy for long-term health and pension needs of the UK has been parked for too long, and actually the cross-party support for the steps that have been taking place recently I think is really welcome, but we need a lot more, because when I talk to foreign investors about the UK as a whole, and by the way it's not just the UK, other countries in Europe face the same challenges, actually they just as when they appraise a company, they look at has it thought about its long-term liabilities? Has it got a strategy for those? So they look at the UK and they don't necessarily see the fundamental grip of those challenges, which I think we've started to be talking about, which is great. But I think really following through that, and if I make a point, the more we have cross-party consensus around significant elements of that, the more powerful I think that will be as a signal for the UK.
Okay.
Can I
just have a supplementary? Just one or two of you mentioned regionality as well, and in terms of fintech and green finance, and Scotland as the home of the European Charter of Excellence in fintech, I believe. So, do you think there's space there to actually focus more on regional or national economies within the UK to actually guarantee that growth in the future? And I suppose taking things out of London and the South East, does that actually enhance our opportunities to actually really put the foot to the floor on growth for the whole of the country, as opposed to smaller, more distinct sectors?
I think we've no choice. I think we have to.
I mean, as many of my colleagues work for Standard Life, a fantastic Scottish business up in Edinburgh, so of course we think there's great opportunities for financial services in Scotland. But actually, many of these productive investments are inherently place-based. So the roles of metro mayors, the role of devolved government is going to be incredibly important in convening the people that are needed to get that physical investment into their local economy.
Sally, anything to add?
Totally agree.
Shira, last word.
Yeah, also very much agree.
Thanks. Answer back quickly.
Yeah, two quick questions. One to you, James. Any countries have there been any countries you think have done it right around the long-term liability around pensions?
Well, I think there's numerous examples. Tim will be even more steeped in them, but I'm spending some time looking at this too. I think Australia and Canada are widely cited. They're not as perfect as they sound, but there are a whole load of countries that have got significant funding for state pension obligations. They've got, the UK actually has got relatively good levels of funding compared to a lot of other countries for private sector pensions, but that's still not close to being enough. So the auto-enrolment point that Tim makes, it's just obvious if you look at the maths that we have to do something on that.
And just you, Sally, because you've just mentioned this, again, I'm slightly leading, but cross-party, cross-department, cross-industry, there must be an organisation, there must be a body within government that could be used on this. Do we start looking to revamp the Board of Trade? Do we start looking to try and create the structure that gives you that long-term certainty about the direction of travel?
I would absolutely welcome that. It would be that sense of cross-party, cross-government, cross-department need for coordination. It's just not there in the way we need it to be right now.
Charlotte Nichols, please.
Thank you, Chair. The Resolution Foundation and LSE Centre for Economic Performance have argued that the UK's services specialism can form the bedrock of a growth strategy, and all of you have spoken today about the important role that services play in the economy and what it could do for growth. But I just wanted to come onto some of the sort of specific points you've raised. Sally, you talked before about the statistics and, a potential lack of trust in them. Do you think it's an issue of measurability or an issue of definability, i.e. does the government actually understand what it is you do? If I could start with you, Sally, and I'll go down the panel.
So the short answer is yes. Try putting that in the record. The longer answer is they would understand it much better if we didn't have such a churn of ministers and officials. The number of times I've had an enthusiastic official phone me and say, I'm the new head of services at DBT. What do I need to know? And I say enthusiastically the first time, oh, let me tell you about our professions, here's a paper. And then 3 months later I get another call with a new bright, shiny-eyed official saying, I'm the new head of services at DBT. And you start to kind of be a little bit world-weary, and you dust out the paper you wrote 3 months ago and you send it across and you explain again about how the profession... And by the time that's happened half a dozen times, you do tend to become tarnished. So there is enthusiasm there. The officials are bright people who are enthusiastic and wish to understand and learn, but some continuity would be an enormously helpful thing.
Well, I completely agree with Sally. I think that the thing is, government is so big and so complex. So you can find one part of government where you've got people who are very, very supportive. But it's huge. I'm not trying to criticise anyone, because it is much more complicated than everybody in the outside world thinks it is. And so one of the challenges I see is we can have support at MOJ, where we actually have a very strong relationship as a sector. You know, they have been very supportive. We bought into long-term investment in the courts and so on, which is fundamental, not just for exports, but for society. And then we have proposals which are really well intended, come out of the Home Office or a different department, for something where there's been no serious consideration of the business implications, the investment implications. You know, an awful lot of measures against sort of areas. So we had the failure to prevent fraud offence that came in, which exempted small companies, thankfully, because actually it would have just been a crushing burden for them. But we've got a regime that criminalises negligence by companies, not intentional criminality. That's pretty counter the general principles of law, and it came in a rush, and there was no consideration of the cost of it. The evidence base for it was very, very limited, and I'm sure it was sincerely meant and there were some identified problems, but it's probably going to cost businesses, I don't have evidence for this, several £100 million a year that's come in.
Thank you. Shira, you said before about half of young people wanting to be content creators, and Sally, that was a point that you'd picked up on. I don't mean to demean the skills involved. Party comms from all parties, I think we can all agree, could do with being better, and there are far too many MPs and ex-MPs with terrible podcasts, very sort of cringy social media use. So, you know, as I said, I don't demean it as a skill. But what does this mean for the other sectors that we also need, and the sort of resilience for the UK wider workforce?
Yeah, so just to define, content creation also goes well beyond podcasts, TikTokers, young people dancing on TikTok. I'm talking about game development, TV production and development, film, media, journalism. There is a huge breadth of what we mean when we say content creators, and the desire of young people to be part of that broad, giant industry that includes tech development, etc. In terms of what that means for other sectors, I'm not sure I can speak about that, but you know, I think it is imperative that we understand that there is that desire, and we facilitate that in the best way possible by, again, supporting businesses, supporting early stage sort of career development programs, education in universities. I think that there's still a bit of a stigma around the creative industry, that it's not a viable career path, that it's not a sustainable career path. Let's also put advertising, by the way, into the creative industry. It's a massive industry in the UK. So I think in terms of looking and what are the risks to other sectors, I think actually we shouldn't be looking at that, but be looking at the opportunity if we did sort of act upon this and facilitate that.
And let's be clear, my 3 sons, none of them are going to be content creators. None of them are talented enough. And if my 13-year-old doesn't stop narrating his entire life as if it's on YouTube, I'm going to have him adopted. But the desire to be part of a glamorous, interesting sector is really, really important, and making sure people understand what they can and can't do and where their skills are, and fostering the skills that they have is the really important part here, I think.
Yeah,
I'm glad, just a quick one, I'm glad that you picked up about video games there, for example. That's something that we have a lot of in my constituency in the development of. But do you think the creative sectors do enough to talk about the transferable skills and other places where they can be used? I think there is a value in all of these skills, but we see, for example, with video game design, that you can use it in, you know, creating virtual environments for defence, or you can use it in, you know, civil nuclear and all these sorts of things. Do the way that we talk about skills in sectors like yours kind of pigeonhole it into something that can only be used in those places, instead of, again, as part of a broader piece about skills?
I think it depends. I think if you go into the industry itself, there is a lot of social mobility, and I think especially in SMEs, we sort of encourage that mobility. I think if you're, looking all the way into university degrees in education, which I don't know if I'm digressing, there is very much sort of a very one-way vision to these skills and career development. So I think there could be a lot more to be done there and show sort of the breadth of career opportunities that there are.
I think there's a really important element of this, which is as society ages, we're going to have multiple careers. The importance of transferable skills is only going to go up. We currently have 500,000 economically inactive over 50s who want to get back into the workforce. So getting them to develop the skills of the future is equally important. We've done a lot of work through our think tank, Phoenix Insight, with an organisation called Careers Can Change, which is specifically about trying to help people in later stages of their career retrain and look at other opportunities.
And James, just before I hand back to the chair, it's just a very quick point. You spoke about the legal framework and some of the issues where different departments do something that, they may be considered to be helpful, but turns out not to be. I mean, is this sort of trade in legal services always a good thing, insofar as there's been a lot of concerns raised recently about strategic lawsuits against public participation and libel tourism, for example? How can we support the legal sector to trade whilst also making sure that we're upholding the rule of law in the UK and the rights of UK citizens to participate?
So look, I think it's a great question, because I think so the City UK Legal Services Group I mentioned I chair, its focus historically was on competitiveness. When I took over as chair, I said we've got two focuses, competitiveness and trust and reputation, because I think, going to the Harrington point about a bedrock, which you've mentioned as well, of these professional services, it's about trust and expertise. It's about both of those things. And trust in the UK is still very high. We talk about loss of trust in financial markets and so on over some event, but it's actually not true. Trust is actually very, very high globally. And I think that those reputational issues matter hugely. What I would say is it is quite complicated, because a law firm, I do believe that people should be accountable for what they do, and as regulated professions like Sally's and mine, regulated sectors, we all have an accountability which I think is healthy, and I think it allows people to speak up when there are issues that they should be challenging. But we don't have perfect visibility on every client who comes along. And we try to, and we want to take ethical decisions around that, but it is not completely straightforward. I think that the regulators have continued to focus on those things, and where people have acted entirely inappropriately, they should be accountable for that. So I think it's a very important point. And I think that reputational issue is part of our strength.
Final question, Anthony Higginbottom, who I know will be very brief.
I will be as brief as possible, Chair. I want to touch on emerging technologies and the way it could shape the services sector moving forwards. If we take something like artificial intelligence, I still think there's an unknown about whether it will be as transformative or not compared to expectations. But with AI as an example, do you see that as being all about productivity improvements, or could it displace entire sectors of the service economy? And how do we manage that transition depending on which side it's on?
Will I kick off? And so I agree with you. I'm not sure that it is going to be as transformative as people think. What we found so far is that it is fantastic at analysing very, very large data sets to spot trends which the human eye simply can't see. It is, so the kind of places where we're using it is in our forensics practice, when we're looking at hundreds of contracts for unusual contract terms. I suspect our audit practice will probably end up using it as well to spot the anomalous transactions that might otherwise inevitably slip through the net. Where we're finding it currently less useful is around areas where judgment is needed, where you're applying facts and a certain law or regulation or situation to facts and circumstances to try and determine what the best outcome might be. So actually what we're not seeing it currently as being a displacement. It's much more about not even so much it's about being much better than we otherwise would be with the same resources available to us, rather than displacing staff or activity.
Just to add, I mean, Sally's probably more expert on it than I am, and I'm definitely not a sort of guru on it, but the way I look at it, is I think it feels to me like one of those classic things which is going to change less in the short term than people think, but more in the long term. I think it will have some displacement impact if we're honest about it. But I think, again, from our sector's perspective, the rest of the world has got this technology. And if we don't adopt it, the cost benefits of AI, the efficiency and outcomes benefits that will be there, it'll have good consequences and negative consequences. And I think if we don't engage with the good, we're going to lose out to others who are going to. So one of the challenges for us in professional services is cost. If we cannot be competitive, going back to this bedrock point for attracting other investment, other industries into the UK through our capability, if the UK is just too expensive to do business relative to other places, it will ultimately struggle. So I think we have to use it and find principles-based ways to engage with it.
And do you get the sense that the government is looking at it in that way and trying to support the amazing services sector we've got now and encouraging them to use AI to do all of those things? Or are we looking too much at it as this innovative technology and we need to look at it in isolation?
My biggest concern right now is that, as far as I can tell from the documents published by the government, they're looking at how to regulate the outputs. And I think the bigger question is how to regulate the inputs, because until you know exactly what's going in, number one, you can't make sure that the creative industries get the copyright protection that they deserve. Yeah. And number two, how can you regulate the output until you know how the large language models and similar have been trained? So I actually think it's not that we're looking at AI incorrectly, it's that there's a big chunk of our thinking that's currently missing.
Okay. And if I can just move on very briefly to another, I'll call it an emerging technology, esports, so it's more in the creative type sector. We know that is a very valuable commodity. It's growing across the world. How do we make sure that young people see that as a viable career and that our careers advisors and universities and colleges recognise it for what it is and don't put it in that box of it's what every young person wants to do and no one's actually going to do it? I'm going to come to you, Shira, because you're the creative on the panel.
Yeah, I have to say that esports is not exactly my forte, but I think it goes back to exactly what we were talking about before. It's about creating enough sort of educational opportunities and early stage career opportunities for young people that allow them to understand the various pathways and the different careers within the esports industry, and again, not pigeonholing it into one thing that might sort of deter them from entering. But I might pass this on to someone else if they've got anything to say to that.
I don't know what esports are, so I really should.
Thank you. All right, well, thank you very much. We'll treat that as an opportunity to draw to a close this session. Can I just a couple of takeaways, and that was particularly Sally, your point you made about the need for continuity and contact with government. So if there's going to be a strategy, then government needs to understand what the sector is, and that needs to be ongoing through a period of time. You remind us about the issue of poor data, but nonetheless, I think, James, you remind us that services are under the radar and make up 80% of the economy, and that's why we've just done this very important session. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Suspended. The proceeding is currently 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 suspended.
Order. Good morning. It is still just good morning, and welcome to our guests on our third panel, where we're looking at the approach to the government's industrial strategy, where we have a session on emerging technologies. And I wonder if I could open that up by asking each of you to tell us a little bit about your organisation, but perhaps telling us what you consider to be an emerging technology. So, Victor, would you start?
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. So I'm Victor from Synthesia. Here with a very short version, we're an AI company, around 350 employees. And we develop technology for the creative sectors to produce video using artificial intelligence. I think for me, emerging technologies is a broad word. I think some people may think of that as the size of the company. Other people may think of it as the sort of technology you're using. I'll probably subscribe more to the latter. So I would say technologies like artificial intelligence is very much an emerging technology. It's something we're still discovering. What is it? How can it be used? How it's going to transform society? I'd put blockchain, virtual reality, and similar types of technologies in that bucket as well.
Thank you, Victor. Josh.
Hi there. Thank you for having me. Josh Weston, CEO and co-founder of SpaceForge. SpaceForge really is an advanced materials company first and a space company second. We manufacture next-generation compound semiconductor materials. However, we happen to do that in space. We're based in Cardiff. We currently employ 58 people here. We have an office in the US as well with 2 other people. I believe that emerging tech is actually a bit of a misnomer. I prefer to think of it as finally it's reached a point of disruption that people are beginning to call it emerging. Compound semiconductors are not new. They've been existing for the past 60, 70 years. Equally, we look at spacecraft. The UK have been launching them since the 1960s. We're just in a position now in the 21st century where we can talk about them much better than we were able to before.
Thank you. And Sharon.
Yes, thank you for inviting me. I'm Sharon Todd, Chief Executive of SCI, which is a charity formed at the start of the last industrial revolution by the founders of the last industrial revolution, so people like William Lever, Siemens family, Pilkingtons, etc. And the charitable objective or purpose of the organisation is to accelerate science out of the lab into industry for the benefit of society. So quite a big organisation. We network across industry, government and academia and interface into energy, science, a variety of science sectors. In terms of emerging technology, I think for me it's when it starts to impact on society. When science, for example, starts to become less of a theoretical concept and more of an applied concept and something that can then actually be used for society. So examples in our space would obviously be the genomics area, which is a big area. I think you've heard from Richard Torbett this morning around that. Hydrogen might be another one, and some of the material spaces that Josh has also alluded to.
Okay, and we heard in our previous session that in the UK we're pretty good at science and research and innovation, but we're less good at commercialisation. So how good are we in the sectors you're familiar with, and perhaps each of our witnesses, in actually developing something that's significant for the UK economy from these emerging technologies?
Yes, it's a good point. We used to be good at the commercialisation, but I think we feel now we have lost that skill of taking science out of the lab. That's been very much the manifesto that we launched last year. There are a lot of data points, and I'm sure the committee have heard many of them, around the deindustrialisation that's happened in science-based industry in the UK, and the fact that the UK is falling behind, not just at a broad GDP level. So if you look at, for example, the last 20 years, the average GDP growth in the UK has been 1.5%. The global average has been 3.5%. And we are behind, and many of those economies that are powering ahead have strong industrial strategies and strong industrial strategies for science.
So I think the point that you made is a very good one. We have a great academic science base, a great asset base to utilise, but we believe a lot more needs to be done to convert that science into valuable products and businesses that then actually create value for society.
And Josh, you told us you're in Cardiff. How did you come to be in Cardiff?
It was a lot cheaper than Bristol, and it made geographical sense. So Wales is one of the important things that we do at Spaceforge is once you've produced those materials in space, you have to be able to bring them home. Wales is pretty much the only geographic location in the UK where you could actually bring a satellite back to our own territory. So it's very important for us to be able to do that. But I would also say Wales is really one of the last bastions that we have for advanced materials manufacturing in the UK. So more historically, that would be steel. Today, compound semiconductors. So there is the compound semiconductor cluster in Newport, which stretches into Cardiff and Swansea as well, where we produce what are today the most advanced computer chips we have.
And presumably what you do pretty mobile and could be anywhere else in the world. How do we anchor it where you are?
Is one of the challenges I have today. So we've been pretty successful at raising venture capital funding. We've raised 15 million to date. 95% of that has been from abroad. Interestingly, our largest singular check has actually come from Germany, but most of our investors are based out of the US. So I think to echo what Sharon was saying, if we look historically at the UK sort of latter part of the 20th century, it was a huge, we just invented so many things, but so many of them were passed on to and commercialized and scaled elsewhere. So that's the question I'm now having to answer as a CEO is how do I make sure we can grow and scale here as opposed to going abroad?
Victor, we didn't hear where you were in the UK, but why are you here and what will keep you here?
I'm from Denmark originally, if you're wondering my accent from. I actually moved to the UK 8 years ago to start my company, Synthesia. We're in London, and I moved to the UK because I think the UK actually has one of the best foundations for building AI companies. There's great academic talent, there's great pool of science, and of course it's the financial center of the European region. So I am actually, as an outsider, pretty happy to be here. I think it's overall a pretty good system. I will very much echo what Josh said before. We've raised around $160 million in venture capital, and unfortunately, more or less all of that comes from the US, especially in the earlier phases where we were not a proven product, where we weren't successful yet. It was very, very difficult to find the type of capital that wanted to take a bet on what sort of started out more as a science project than as a business.
Okay, thank you. Julie Mars.
Thank you very much, Chair. Can I start by asking, we're looking at the industrial policy, this whole inquiry, which a lot of the questions seem to focus on picking winners and government picking winners. In your view, perhaps I could start with Victor, how confidently can governments pick the technologies that we should be investing in?
I have very low confidence in that. Okay. I think that the best way to approach this problem is to say that there are two phases of creating great companies. There's the first phase, which is the discovery phase. This is the early stages of a company's life, where essentially you don't have a business yet, right? And I think in this phase, you want lots of experimentation, you want lots of iteration. And I think it is default positive that a government subsidizes some of those companies that cannot raise from the markets themselves. I think that's a good thing. But I think that's a very different problem from once a company becomes successful, how to make sure you anchor it here and make it as successful as possible. So I think there's a lot of talk about funding, for example, for early stage companies, that it's a difficult funding environment. I understand that, but I think it's a very different thing when you look at how do we make the most successful companies even more successful and anchor them. Technology is a power law, it's a game of power laws, where it's very few companies that make by far most of the returns. That is, of course, also what we've seen play out over the last 10, 20 years, where unfortunately most of the global juggernauts in technology is residing in the US. I think that the UK as a country, as I said before, has a great foundation for doing this. I think what later stage companies need, specifically in AI, which is the world that I come from, is competitive advantages that makes it great to be in the UK. That could, for example, be subsidized GPUs. That's a very, very important part of building an AI company. Doing training runs can go into the double-digit millions, but that's very, very expensive. think it's very important, though, that this does not become let's build a supercomputer that companies can access, because no serious company is going to use a supercomputer that a government has built for them. It needs to be easy to use and frictionless. It's essentially a type of R&D tax, you could say. The second thing that I would urge is access to training data. A country like the UK has vast amounts of data in the NHS, in climate, and transportation. And this is a gold mine for AI companies. I think that taking that data, of course, anonymizing it, putting it into a shape where it's useful, and potentially providing that only to UK-based companies, that would be a big competitive advantage. And the last one I would urge you to think about is mandating AI adoption in the public sector. The public sector is a huge consumer of software, like any other company is today. And especially for a lot of these sectors like health, it's historically pretty difficult to go to market, right? If the UK mandated that the public sector uses AI as much as they can to be as efficient as possible, which would be net beneficial for the country, it would also create an amazing way for companies based in the UK to go to market. But those three things are what I think can make the UK a country that has a real competitive advantage. And maybe my last note on this would be, I think every company in the world today is talking about how they become an AI superpower. Very, very few companies have the foundations to do that. The UK has it because we have the talent. The US obviously has it. China has it. And I think that's more or less the three countries that actually have the foundations of it, right? Now, if you take the foundation and you marry it with great competitive advantage, I think that's a winning strategy. You have the UAE and countries in the Middle East, they're already subsidizing GPUs for their company. They're saying, come here, we'll basically give you free compute, right? But they don't have the talent and the science pool to make it happen. So I think if the UK wants to win out on this, it needs to combine the amazing foundation with actual real competitive advantage that matters for late-stage companies.
Thank you. The same question to Josh. Are you more or less confident than Victor that governments can predict which are the successful technologies?
I am more confident in the ability to predict, but I probably have the same level of confidence in the level of intervention that requires those winners or those successes to actually translate through. So if we look at some of the sort of sectors under the sort of Britain as a science power, I think they're the right call. That they do include space, they do include semiconductors, they also include the likes of quantum and artificial intelligence and others in biotech. But if we look at the investment into those sectors as a percentage of GDP, they are minuscule compared to our biggest sort of competitors. And I speak of competitors both from a national security perspective, from an economic perspective, and a talent perspective. So, lots of our competitors, the US and the EU, we tend to get on pretty well with, and we tend to work with very well, certainly in academic frames. But we then compete with those arenas for talent, for funding, for the ability to actually make a company a success. So that's where I would really like to see more effort going. I think we've seen some moves in the right direction. So speaking from the space and semiconductor landscape, we had a semiconductor strategy, we've had a national space strategy, we now have a space industrial plan, but we need to see those actually translate into, to be frank, interventions that allow those companies or those technologies to succeed on what is a very dynamic global playing field.
Thank you. Sharon?
Yes, I think coming from the science side, perhaps echoing some of the things that the colleagues on my right, industry is complex. So I think whilst some choices could be made, and government has made some, life sciences, AI, clean tech, etc., I think there's not a fundamental understanding of the core drivers that are really going to make some of those sectors sustainable. So what do I mean by that? For example, there are supply chains that need to be built, and it relates directly to the point about competitiveness. We can build a business around electric vehicles, for example, but unless we have the materials to supply into the batteries, and unless we have a recycling industry that supports recycling of core minerals and materials that are used in the batteries, we're not going to build a sustainable supply chain. So I think, have we made a good start? Yes. Is it comprehensive enough? No. I think there definitely needs to be more thought around what are some of the core underpins that are going to drive sustainability in those choices. I think then also this piece about competitiveness is a really, really critical one. The UK is not performing in terms of competitiveness and making the environment attractive for startups to scale up in science and also for large-scale investments. So, some examples, for example, around the area of UK unicorns. We talk a lot about unicorns in the biotech space. Richard might have covered this earlier this morning. Over the last 15 years, there have been 10 life sciences unicorns created, homegrown unicorns, only 2 of them listed in the UK. Only 2 of them listed in the UK, with the other 8 going to the US. So there's a whole infrastructure piece that needs to be considered. And I think some of your panelists just before, I think connecting all those pieces and how do we create a really sustainable, strong foundation that allows businesses, whether they're coming from the creative industry, space, materials, life sciences, to start up, scale, grow, and then full-scale investment. And I think on the full-scale investment, so talking about large company investment now, I think the review by Richard Harrington very clearly articulated the issues, but also actually the size of the prize. I think he put 50 billion per annum onto the opportunity there if we can create the environment and stimulate, industry to come. For us, the decision by AstraZeneca last year to walk away from the UK, from manufacturing site, and go to Ireland was a real wake-up call. And if we can't support a homegrown business like that's 25 years old today or this year, we have some real challenges. So I think we have to get really gritty about what's working, what isn't working, and then consider that this is a whole ecosystem, an infrastructure that needs to be put in place.
Thank you. When you mentioned the 5 critical technologies already identified, do you think the government's got that right? And is it clear why those choices were made?
I think broadly yes, but to my caveat about what are the underpins to those, material science, for example, being one. I think the government probably has chosen those. I look at those from my industrial background, I say, well, those are probably high growth sectors. They're probably sizable global markets. These are trillion-dollar market businesses. Clean tech's growing at 12%, pharmaceutical, life science growing at 6-7%. They are, I think, and this is very much in kind of our remit area, but they are very R&D intensive. And what that means is that they often take a long time to come to gestation. They need a lot of patient capital. They need some very specific skills. But when they create value, they can create long-term value. Back to my point about we really missed an opportunity with the AstraZeneca plant. So I look at this list and I say, well, actually, if you looked at it strategically, they would probably tick a lot of boxes. And so broadly, we're heading in the right direction, yes. Have we got all the underpins that are really going to support them and champion them and make sure they're successful? I think the answer to that is no. I think there's definitely more thinking that needs to happen.
Okay, thank you. And Victor, presumably you're pleased that AI is one of those 5 choices, but what's your view about whether it's transparent how those choices were made and whether they're the right ones?
Very happy that AI is on the list first and foremost. Yes, I think it makes sense. For me, it feels pretty obvious that it should be those 5. I have not read all the details of exactly how we kind of came to that conclusion, but for me, that seems reasonable.
And we talk about technologies. If you look at it as the cascade, do we then have to pick, or should the government be picking companies then, actual companies that cascade from that? And how does the government do that? Should it be doing that?
I think that's a smart way of approaching the problem, of looking at who is successful rather than who would like to be successful. I think, as I said earlier, creating new companies is a power law. It is very, very few companies that make it, right? If you look at billion-dollar companies, which we heard before, right? There was 10 in the life sciences last year. Predicting which of those are going to be billion-dollar companies in the very early stages is incredibly difficult. The idea is important, obviously. Science is important. The team is important. There's a bunch of outside factors you can't really account for. If it was easy, venture capitalists would be making even more money than they are today. So I think that in general, it's very difficult to predict which companies are going to be successful and which companies aren't. So again, I would urge for this 2 ways of looking at it. There's an early stage funding market. I think in general, the way the government should look at that is that there are some companies that can raise funding from private investors, venture capitalists, etc. And that's great. They're already on their way. Then you probably want to subsidize and help some of those people who may not be able to get over that sort of first gate to actually get started, begin building something, begin developing whatever that they're developing. And then I think there's the other thing of looking at, okay, so which of these companies in this broad umbrella of industries that we care about are successful and do we think could become trillion-dollar companies down the line? And there I think it's not a funding problem. It's, as proposed earlier, I think these are companies that are already working. These are companies that can raise capital, most likely. And they're looking for a place that is the best garden to grow in, essentially. And I think if you speak to most successful, at least in my industry of technology companies, they're not looking for money or funding, right? That's not the thing that's on our minds. What's on my mind is I really want to build, we are a unicorn company today. I want to stay here. I want to build a global technology giant in the UK. But I'm already seeing why that's difficult. And some of those things are things that are very difficult to change. There's just more talent in the US that I need to hire. Some of those things are structural, around the London Stock Exchange, for example, which I think has not had a great run the last 10 or 15 years. Everyone's listing in the US, as was proposed before. And then there's the regulatory sort of specific to AI, right, which of course is very much up in the air right now. Do you want to be in Europe right now as an AI founder? Absolutely not. Everyone is fleeing. Do you want to be here? Yeah, I think actually what we've heard and seen so far is very reasonable. The US probably also more on the pro-business side of things. Japan going in a very extreme sort of direction, saying you can train on any data that you want, no matter if it's copyright or not. I'm not saying that's the right thing to do, but they're taking a very strong stance that they want to be a country in which you can build AI companies. And there are already a lot of AI companies now starting offices in Japan. So I think those are the things that you look for when you are past the point of trying to make something work, which is for us at least was the first 3 or 4 years of the company where it was still, it wasn't completely luck. It was probably also some skill involved, but there's a lot of factors that's very difficult to predict. And I think that the private markets are better at predicting that than governments.
Okay, thank you. Josh, how do you agree? Do you agree with that?
I think I look at it really from the other side of the coin. It's very difficult to get more foundational technology than semiconductors. It's literally in everything. It's the 19th century depended on coal, the 20th century depended on oil. The 21st century, as we have already seen, will entirely depend on semiconductors, compute power, the ability to put them into electric vehicles, the ability to conduct quantum calculations, whatever they are. But because they are so critical to so many sectors, you then cannot step away from how critical they are to essentially critical national infrastructure, how everything succeeds, how we effectively protect our way of life in the West. So I do actually look to the really the tools that government has really has at its disposal to be able to invest, characterize and protect those technologies to keep them here. So some of those early stage companies mentioned, or even at an academic level, accessing grants is fairly easy, provided you have the right team and you know how to put together a proposal for Innovate or one of the research organisations. But I equally am not coming here cap in hand asking UK Gov to put some money in. Actually, I think we can just much better be able to spend the money we're already spending, but leverage it in a different way. So, for example, if I take the balance between grants and contracts to an investor are worth, for every £1 spent on a contract, probably worth about 10 to an investor, whereas for a grant to an investor, it's probably worth about 50p. So, but you could use the same pot of money. You can keep the company and hold them to account much better. And if anything, have better control out of their deliverables, because most grants, some will reach the conclusion of, sorry, this didn't work, but it was a research organisation or it was a research task to see whether it did or not it did, but that's second stage. Contracts from those same bodies, it could be Innovate, it could be the Ministry of Defence, it could be the UK Space Agency, it could be out of the UK Semiconductor Strategy Fund, will allow the UK to much better leverage global markets to its advantage. And I think we've seen that certainly in artificial intelligence, not least with some of the money that you've been able to raise in the UK. That's a phenomenal achievement. There's the opportunity for the UK to be able to replicate that in every one of those 5 critical sectors, provided we spend the money we have more wisely.
Josh, may I just say, you spoke about interventions earlier, and when you said interventions, I did wonder whether you were talking about investment or grants, but you're saying definitely not. You'd much rather have business orders.
So I mean, government can certainly be a customer of what I can do at Spaceforge. But
so that's the intervention that you would like to see, rather than funding through grants and one-off bits of support.
So grants have their place. Yeah. So if I take the space sector, for example, last year was the Space Cluster Infrastructure Fund. One of the biggest releases the UK Space Agency have ever done. It allowed companies, including ours, to purchase the capital equipment we need to establish an industrial base here. What we then need is the ability to run work through that industrial base. That's where I think grants have their place. I would say, though, I would keep the investments that UK government are able to make. So I think we see those in the likes of NSIF, the National Security Strategic Investment Fund, British Business Bank, etc., because those can encourage companies to stay here and scale here for what is, chiefly actually a pretty small piece of leverage.
Sorry, Chair.
Go on. I'm conscious of time. I'll leave it there. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Charlotte Nichols, please.
Thank you, Chair. And I wanted to pick up on one of the points that you were making earlier, Victor. Legislation around sort of online safety and digital competition is such a bin fire because it tries to kind of put the genie in the bottle after the fact. And I speak to civil nuclear companies in my constituency who tell me that, the questions they're asked by the regulator are completely irrelevant to the type of technology that they're proposing. So, how do we get the balance right with, emerging technologies, particularly things like sort of genomics and artificial intelligence, to create a framework where we can be sure that everything is safe and appropriately regulated, and where you have the stability that you need to invest, but where we're not putting up those kind of artificial barriers that you referred to in, sort of the EU and so on? Where do we find that balance?
So again, I can speak to my industry. I think life sciences and other industries will be different, right? I think in AI, the most important thing is that we focus on reducing the outcomes we do not want. We don't focus on algorithms or specific technologies or size of training runs and these sort of, which feels very arbitrary in some sense. If you look at AI, I think we can, in this room, sit down today and we can make a pretty good list of areas in which we think AI can have a harmful impact, right? It can be used for impersonation with deepfakes. It can be used to induce bias in medical decision-making and a lot of those sorts of things. And I think starting from that, working backwards, how does that work with the current laws? Are the current laws up to date? We take impersonation and deepfakes, for example, right? That is already illegal today to impersonate someone. But how does the law sort of slot into a world in which this is going to be possible with AI? So I think it's very important to start from the outcomes and not rush into making regulation. A lot of the things that AI will create harm with is already issues today. That's not because they create net new issues, right? They kind of amplify an existing problem, or they maybe slightly change the shape of an existing problem. But I feel like there's too much discourse around people making up sci-fi ideas of what AI is going to do and happen. That's an important part of the discussion, but that should maybe be 10%. And 90% should be, hey, we know we have these technologies today. We know they can create harms. How do we reduce the things that everybody can agree that we do not want? And I actually think the UK has done pretty well on this so far. There has been, in the EU, there was a lot of talk at some point about technical details of how big models are you allowed to train, and this is, I think this can end up being a very odd sort of world in which you're then not allowed to do certain things and write certain algorithms. But at the same time, the technology is moving ahead. So maybe those rules that were made 6 months ago, they're completely outdated 6 months later. Let's focus on the outcomes that we do not want and work backwards from that. Because I think very few people who work in these industries are interested in any of those harmful outcomes. Where it becomes more tricky is if you say this type of algorithm you can't train, or so I would kind of start there.
That's very interesting, thank you. Very pertinent, because I think the government's announced some new work coming forward on sort of deepfake pornography today. Yep. So I think that output-based discussion is going to be a very live one over the coming months. Sharon, if I could bring you in.
Yes, obviously I'm sort of representing a more established sector, maybe than one that's kind of emerging. But I think your point's a really interesting one. You know, if we're going to drive renewable carbon, for example, hydrogen, some of these new emerging technologies, if that's what we're calling them, I wonder whether sometimes we make the process of regulation very complex. And actually, you know, starting with what are the principles we're trying to drive, And in that conversation, having key stakeholders, including industry, to say what are the outcomes we're trying to drive, and then work back from there to where the regulation needs to be. The regulators are already very heavily tasked, and I think trying to make incremental steps forward is always challenging when there's a kind of day job to do. So I just wonder whether this is an area where the UK could be agile, it could be innovative, and it could bridge what I think it does quite well, which is sit between the kind of carrot and stick approach that comes from the US and the EU. You can derive yourself which one I'm referring to there. But, I think we are quite good at finding that sort of agile middle ground that's also grounded in science. For us, the regulation would have to be grounded in good science, independent science. So I think there's a real opportunity for the UK to think very differently about regulation and how it sets up new regulation.
Josh, anything you'd like to add?
Effectively, my activities are somewhat unregulated. So you may know, but space is currently treated like international waters. So in many ways, I operate as a space pirate when I make things up there. If you've seen The Martian, it's a very good explanation on that. So we're in a position where, so for example, if I give a real-world example of one of our upcoming missions, we develop and build the platform in the UK, we develop the materials manufacturing technology in the UK. It then gets exported temporarily to America, where it goes for launch. It spends some time up in space, maybe 6 months. At the end of that production run, deploys its re-entry technology and comes back. Right now it comes back to Portugal because we can't establish the correct regulation here with the CAA. I'm very happy to work with them on making sure, because obviously Portugal can close down about half of the Atlantic, the UK can't do that. So having the opportunity to work with a position with a friendly country where we can do that and eventually transport it here, excellent. But that then presents me with a very strange problem, which is, did I ever actually make that material in the UK? And if I didn't, did I make it in Portugal? If I made it in Portugal, actually the biggest cost is not even going to space, it's the imports and duties and customs I have to pay when I get the material back here. So our CFO at Spaceforge has worked some miracles and has basically done a map of places we can return spacecraft to, which are then close to Freeport organisations, which we can then Freeport about to do that. And I would add to that so you may have seen the UK had a launch last year from the UK, first time ever. We were on board. The CAA have done an incredible job, along with the UK Space Agency and the Department of Transport, in being able to allow that activity to happen. So we can license a launch out of the UK, we can license to operate a satellite out of the UK. What we currently can't do is license a return vehicle out of the UK. When we started Spaceforge back in about 2018, there was only one other company in the world proposing to do anything like what we were doing. We're now actively tracking more than 40 competitors, in quotation marks, that are operating in regulatory environments that have already gone ahead, either because they're not too bothered about sort of being beholden to UN articles, etc., or because they've essentially just adapted to have a much more robust and agile regulation framework across those disparate activities. So that's something I'm really keen to be able to push on and work with government to be able to achieve here.
Thank you. And just a very quick one before I go back to the chair again. We've been speaking a lot about, how different departments' policies interact with each other and maybe cause unintended consequences in other places. The proposals by the government to cut the number of international students to UK higher education institutions, do you think that's short-sighted, yes or no?
Yes.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope I'm sitting in front of two future billionaires. I think what you're doing is extraordinary. Sorry, I was referring to you, Sharon. I beg your pardon. You can decide which Josh or Victor who's not there. I think it's fascinating what you've been saying, and actually I think the chair has probably asked the questions that I was already going to ask. But I wonder if I could just ask on reflection about a couple of your remarks. Josh, you mentioned about the three strategies, and I just wonder whether or not you think they are cohesive and they work together, or whether or not they've been very piecemeal and actually they've come about because we're reacting rather than being preemptive in these areas where we should be.
A combination of all of the above. Okay. So in the time that I've operated across the space and semiconductor industry, in the space industry, when I joined about a decade ago, there was the Innovation and Growth, then there was the update to the Innovation and Growth, then there was the Industrial Strategy Challenge Fund, then there was the National Space Strategy, and now from that is the Space Industrial Plan. The semiconductor industry has effectively done without until having the UK semiconductor strategy. What has been at least important that I've seen from the space side has been the Space Industrial Plan and elements of the National Space Strategy finally brought different departments together. I would really like to see more cross-government discipline in being able to join that up, because otherwise, as we have previously, we've had a separate space strategy on the civil side and a separate space strategy on the defence side. It's pretty much impossible to separate the two.
In the budget, we announced a British ISA, and given, Victor, your comments about how much investment is attracted from the United States, especially into your business, I think you quoted 168 million, was it? Mm-hmm. I mean, what does that sort of say to you that the government is sort of shifting in terms of encouraging investment into British businesses? Right mood music, or far more needs to be done? Get on with it.
No, I think that's great. I think it's a great first step. I think the sort of issue of attracting investment is hard to fix with a single policy, right? I think there's a lot of cultural sort of things around this, mainly being that venture capital investors in the UK, for example, it's just general, they have less risk appetite than they do in the US, because in the US they have a lot more money, right? It makes more sense to make big bets. They've seen much more of these kind of successes. So I think it's not a kind of a blanket policy that can solve this problem, but I do think it's a step in the right direction. I do think that the last 3 years after COVID happened has actually changed a lot. I think investors have a more global perspective. But I still think the most important thing for attracting outside investment, especially from the US, is that we get those success stories here. And we are getting them now, right? Like there's great companies here now, and I think what that tells investors in the US is that actually great companies can be built in the UK.
What I'm scared about is that you are going to grow your businesses here, and then you are either going to move them and list them somewhere else, and we've mentioned the London Stock Exchange and the failure to see big listings of late, or you're going to sell. And I don't really want to, I would prefer you to list here and grow a multi-billion pound company in the UK. And I guess I wonder if you could just sort of, either of you, speak to that, and what keeps you in the UK. I mean, obviously I can't ask you when you are going to list, but perhaps you could just give us some idea of what will keep you here.
Well, I think that's I think you're right to feel that. That is unfortunately what happens to a lot of great technology companies early in their life cycle. I think the LSE, the London Stock Exchange problem, is very real. I have not met a single founder of a billion-dollar company in the UK who has ever even considered that an option, almost. So I think there are some structural things to look at there, for sure. Secondly, I think it's some of the things I talked about before, right? If sort of the environment is on par with the US in terms of the regulatory environment, then it's easy as a founder to look at the US and say, well, there's a lot more capital there, there's a lot more talent, why would I actually stay in the UK? And that's where these competitive advantages that I sort of described earlier comes into play, right? Which is, of course, not something they're doing in the US. If you're building a health tech AI company, for example, and you could get access to a trove of NHS data, and you could only get that access if you're rooted here, that is a very real thing. Every AI company in the world right now is budgeting tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars to acquire proprietary training data, right? That is a real competitive advantage you could provide with these types of companies. I think the GPU subsidy is another interesting thing here, right? Where you essentially create competitive advantages that makes it better for someone like us to stay in the country. And the reason I'm not mentioning investment here is because, and this is just being very honest, I think for the best companies and the companies you really want to keep here, that is not an issue. These are highly competitive rounds with lots of great investors from all over the world. Capital is not the issue. It's not what's going to make us stay here.
Just finally, if I may, Victor and Josh, please feel free to jump in on this. Data and intellectual property and where we are on this. I mean, how much of that is also within the sort of the bandwidth of what keeps you here and what makes us attractive? Because I say this from a trade perspective. We're very proud of what we're signing with places like Singapore, where we've got digital partnerships, where we're leading. We would argue we're leading the world in terms of having this new standard and benchmark. Just wonder how you feel about it, what it says for your businesses.
I think I'm probably less right place to answer those things because I run a purely software business. So I have a lot of respect for folks like Josh who run, in many ways, much more complex business, both in the production and delivery side, but also very much on the regulatory side. So maybe I'll pass it over to you, Josh.
I think by its nature, both semiconductors and space are global businesses. Space, because you can see the whole planet. Semiconductors, because even down to the raw material extraction, you have to go to a different country to get access to those. So I do think those partnerships are incredibly important. What I would say, though, is perhaps in somewhat of a contradiction to Victor, is actually I think some of those things he listed as disadvantages are to our advantage. I mean, yes, the US has a much bigger population. Arguably, it has a bigger talent pool, but it can only access US talent. One of the actual real benefits to being in the UK is we can access rest of the world talent. So, as much as we're 50 people at Space Forge, we represent 23 different countries. Australia, Japan, Brazil, some EU member states. To be honest, it's beginning to look a bit like a model UN at Space Forge. And I'm very proud of it, not least because our lunchtimes are incredible. And I think, I'm also speaking from a much earlier stage of company than Victor is when it comes to investment. So while I have certainly ambitions to list, I've made no decision on those yet. Those are a problem for future Josh. What I would say is that characterization of risk appetite I've very much seen in some of those early stages. I've had 30-minute phone calls from sort of, first 50 employees at Uber, and at the end of that 30 minutes, they've gone, put me in for $500,000. Whereas the UK angel ecosystem is very much about how do I preserve my SEIS or EIS tax allowance. And I believe that fundamentally, if that is your first question, rather than how can I make an excellent return with this incredible technology, we are at odds. So I do think the British ISA was a step in the right direction, but actually I'd like to see much more appetite in those earliest, almost nascent stages of technology investment. If anything, encouraging almost an EIS, an entrepreneurial tax relief, which encourages those people that have succeeded in the UK to put back in. I have very little or very few champions to look at, both in the semiconductor landscape and the space landscape, that have succeeded in growing incredible companies in the UK and stayed here, as opposed to having come from abroad and moved back abroad or taken their business elsewhere.
Thank you. And Sharon, would you like to just add a point on this sort of road to commercialisation?
No, I absolutely would. I think there's a huge danger here that we try and pick off one or two things to fix. And that's been a massive issue with our whole approach to industrial strategy for the last 20 years. Well, let's just pull one lever here, or maybe another lever here, or somebody shouts loud over here. And I think the point was made earlier about, what's at the heart of our industrial strategy? What does it mean? We've got a statement to be a science superpower. So what? What does that mean? What are the KPIs? What are we trying to drive? And I think that systematic, more detailed and thoughtful approach that really sets down structures, ecosystems that will survive whichever companies come to the UK and help them thrive and grow and list and create jobs and value for the UK. I think there's a real danger that we try and pick off two or three things and think we fixed the problem. This is a systemic problem. It's a problem that's come from, I think, a lack of attention to detail and a holistic view. And I think we need to take a long-term view. We need to, I'm sure many people in front of you have said the same thing, cross-party support. It needs to be bedded down into systems, processes and structures. But we need to take, what are the core interventions that need to happen in sequence together that are really going to drive startups to scale and go to large scale, then to list, and what's also going to drive large-scale companies to invest significantly also in the UK, because that all adds into the infrastructure. So I think we just need to be very careful about picking one or two things to fix.
Thank you.
May I draw this session to a close by thanking our witnesses for a really interesting session. And we don't regularly talk about AI, we don't talk about AI enough, we certainly don't talk about what goes on in space. And the bit I picked up from the session, Josh, you said that I think when you started in 2018 you were the only company doing what you're doing, and now there are 40 so across the world. So, you know, where an emerging technology exists, there will be plenty of other people who will go for that, and we need to keep our first mover advantage, and we will do that by the access we've got to a UK talent and science pool, which again you reminded us is worldwide rather than just necessarily that here in the UK, which is a positive for us and something we should really bear in mind. So thank you very much indeed. Order.
The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended. The proceeding has ended.